Listen, before I take you into the story, I want you to do something simple. Take one slow breath. Let it settle in your chest. Because what I'm about to tell you is not just a historical episode. It's not a legend whispered by old people on a porch. It's a wound, one that still pulses under the surface of Brazil, even if the world barely knows existed. And maybe it's a story no one ever wanted to survive. So come closer. Let me talk to you as if we were alone in a quiet room, somewhere far away from the noise of the world. Because tonight, we revisit a place that burned itself out of history, a plantation that vanished in flames on the very night slavery ended, a place called Engenho do Rosário in Espírito Santo, 1888. But before the fire, before the screams, before the chains finally fell, there was silence, that heavy kind of silence that belongs to people holding their breath for centuries. A question to you before we begin. Imagine this. You've waited your whole life, your parents' lives, your grandparents' lives, for a single word to be spoken, freedom. And then one night, that word finally arrives, not as a promise, not as a rumor, but as law. Now ask yourself, what would you do if the people who kept you in chains tried to pretend nothing had changed? Hold that thought, because this is exactly what happened at Engenho do Rosário. Setting the stage, May 1888, the air in Espírito Santo that month was unsettling, thick, like a storm waiting for its cue. Newspapers from Rio spread the news. The Golden Law had been signed. Slavery, at least on paper, was over. But plantations across Brazil reacted differently. Some celebrated publicly, some resisted quietly, and a few tried to bury the truth before dawn. Engenho do Rosário belonged to one of those few. The owner, Captain Domingos Falcão, a man who saw himself as untouchable, refused to accept what had happened. To him, the world he knew, his wealth, his power, his control, couldn't just evaporate because a princess wrote her name on a sheet of paper. So he gathered the enslaved in the courtyard and said something that eyewitnesses would repeat for years. Here, nothing changes. Just that, 3 words soaked in arrogance. He told them the law didn't apply there, that the empire was far away, that this land was his, and so were they. But the enslaved people of Rosário, they had already heard the freedom bells, and they were done waiting. A hidden tension, thick enough to taste. People say history moves in silence before it strikes. At Rosário, that silence felt like a blade held to the throat of time. Inside the senzala, the slave quarters, people whispered in the dark. Mothers who had lost children to the slave trade clenched their hands. Men with backs carved by whips stared at the wooden walls, imagining a world outside. Young people who had never known a life beyond orders wondered what freedom even meant. And one woman, who appears in every surviving testimony, rises above the others. Her name was Aparecida. If this were a myth, people would call her a prophet. But she was real, sharp-eyed, tired, and brave in a way the world still doesn't know how to measure. She had a phrase she repeated that night, almost like a prayer. No one steals a sunrise once the sky begins to glow. Those words would become the heartbeat of what happened next. Midnight approaches. As the night deepened, a wind began to move through the cane fields, dry, restless, carrying the smell of earth and something faintly metallic like anticipation. Captain Falcão was inside the big house, drinking, pretending his world wasn't crumbling. His overseers stood guard, rifles slung over their shoulders, muttering about keeping order. But outside, the enslaved community gathered in a tight circle behind the senzala. No leader, no weapons, just one shared, overwhelming truth. If freedom had arrived, it was up to them to claim it. And it was there, in that circle, that Aparecida whispered something that would change everything. Tonight is the last night this place will ever own our names. People nodded. Some cried quietly. Some touched the ground, as if saying goodbye. And then, without ceremony, without shouting, without hatred, they walked toward the sugar mill. The first spark. You need to understand something important. The enslaved people of Brazil had risen up many times before. There were revolts, escapes, rebellions, quilombos that swallowed entire armies. But what happened at Ingenio do Rosario was different. It wasn't war. It wasn't vengeance. It was erasure. They didn't want to take the plantation. They wanted to erase the place where their suffering had been written. And so the first torch was lifted, not with celebration, not with rage, but with the quiet, steady hands of someone who had buried too many dreams in that soil. The flames took quickly. Dry cane burns fast, faster than guilt, one witness later said. The overseers panicked. Captain Foucault stumbled outside, shouting orders no one obeyed. Because fire doesn't follow orders. And neither do people who have finally tasted freedom. The night lit up like a second sun. Crackling wood, sparks flying, smoke rising into a sky that felt suddenly wider, as if opening its chest to breathe. The enslaved didn't run. They stood together and watched the Ingenio burn. That alone tells you everything. There's a moment, right when a fire begins to swallow the world behind you, where time behaves strangely. It stretches, it tightens, it shakes the air like a living thing. Witnesses later said that the flames at Ingenio do Rosario didn't look like ordinary fire. They looked like memory burning. They looked like every unspoken prayer rising at once. And if you had stood near those cane fields that night, you would have heard something the newspapers never mentioned. A silence so powerful it could drown out the screaming. The house of the untouchable burns. Captain Domingos Foucault, who, hours earlier, had declared that nothing would change, rushed out of the big house, his face red, his voice struggling to rise above the roar. He yelled at the enslaved people standing in the courtyard. "Put it out! Do you hear me? Put it out!" But nobody moved, not one person. Imagine the shock of a man who'd lived his entire life believing obedience was eternal, suddenly surrounded by the very people he thought he owned, and finding nothing in their eyes except the calm that terrified him. For the first time, he understood something he had refused to see. The world had changed, and he was the only one still pretending it hadn't. The flames jumped to the roof of the house, his house, eating the timber beams he once bragged were strong enough to outlive the empire. Turns out, freedom burns hotter than arrogance. Aparecida steps forward. No written record can fully capture this moment, but the oral testimonies, the ones passed down quietly, from family to family, agree on one thing. Aparecida stepped forward. Just one step, enough to cut the night in half. She looked at Foucault, the way someone looks at a man digging his own grave. Neither pity nor hatred, just clarity. And she told him, voice steady, "You are asking the wrong people to save what destroyed us." Those words fell heavier than any torch. An overseer tried to raise his rifle, but two other men, former captives, quietly placed their hands on the barrel and lowered it. Not violently, not aggressively, just firmly. History doesn't always change through force. Sometimes it changes through refusal. Inside the sugar mill, the last chains, the sugar mill, the heart of Rosario's wealth, was the second building to catch fire. And inside it, something grotesque became visible, lit by the rising glow. Chains, dozens of them, hanging from the beams. Shackles for wrists too small to ever hold a tool. Iron collars that still smelled of sweat and rust. Whips soaking in brine to make them last longer. Items that the captain had insisted were just for discipline. A lie as old as slavery itself. One young man, barely in his 20s, approached the chains. He touched them lightly, as if touching the bones of his past. Then he stepped back and whispered, "Let all burn." And the mill obeyed. The wooden walls cracked, the grinding wheels melted, and the giant iron gears, the ones that crushed cane into profit, began to glow red, then orange, then white. The machine that had consumed countless lives was itself being consumed. Some people call that symbolism, but the enslaved people of Rosario knew it was justice, not revenge. Justice, what the fire revealed. As the flames spread, something unexpected began to happen. The enslaved community didn't run away. They didn't hide. They didn't fight. They simply moved to the plantation, room by room, field by field, retrieving what was theirs to reclaim. A child's wooden doll hidden under floorboards. A worn rosary someone's mother had held before being sold away. A folded scrap of cloth embroidered with a name long forbidden. A small drum carved from a hollow log, its rhythms banned, its songs silenced. Every object they pulled from the ruins was a reminder of who they had been before the plantation tried to erase them. One elder, her hair silver and her eyes reflecting the firelight, said softly, "We take back what they couldn't steal." Some people think history is made by violence, but sometimes history is made by gathering the pieces of yourself that survived the violence. Meanwhile, in the big house, Captain Foucault stumbled back toward the house, coughing through the smoke. He screamed for his ledgers, his documents, his possessions, the paper architecture of a life built on other people's bones. He begged the men standing near the flames, "Help me, for God's sake, help me." But when he looked at their faces, he realized something devastating. They were free, and he could not command freedom. The rooms he once paraded through now fell apart in front of him. The dining hall where he made toasts over stolen labor. The office where he signed receipts for human beings. The bedroom where he slept above the cries of women forced into the night. All of it collapsing under the fire. People later said that the house made a sound when it gave in, a deep groan, like a dying animal. But one witness, an elderly man who was a child at the time, said something different. It didn't sound like a house dying. It sounded like the land finally exhaling. A decision made in one breath. As the fire reached its peak, Aparecida gathered the community once again. But this time, she didn't give a speech. She didn't rally them. She didn't declare victory. She simply asked, "Are we ready to walk away?" The question was a door. Crossing it meant choosing a world beyond survival. And in the glow of the burning plantation, people looked at each other and nodded. Yes, they were ready. Not to run, not to hide. To live, Tio finally live. If you've ever watched something end right in front of you, you know a strange truth. There is no sound in the world louder than a silence that finally breaks. There was a sound rising over Ingenio do Rosario as the flames began to calm. Not quiet, but a silence shaped like possibility. A silence the land itself seemed to recognize. The enslaved community stood together at the edge of the fields, the fire at their backs, the unknown stretching ahead of them. And for the first time, they were not looking down, not waiting, not bracing themselves. They were simply standing as people, not property. The sky after the fire. By then, the smoke had climbed so high it covered part of the moon, turning its white into a rusty copper glow. Some said it looked like the sky was mourning. Others said it looked like the sky was finally watching. A boy, no older than 12, held his mother's hand and whispered, "Is this what freedom smells like?" She squeezed his fingers and answered, "No, this is what the end smells like. Freedom starts after the smoke clears." Her words didn't tremble. Not anymore. What to do with a future you've never touched. Here's something most history books leave out. Freedom is not a door that swings open. It's a bridge you have to build while walking across it. And the people of Rosario were standing on the edge of a future they had never been allowed to imagine. Many had no idea where to go. No money, no documents, no last names recognized by the law. They were free, yes, but free where? Free how? Aparecida saw their hesitation, and she saw something else too, something that frightened her far more than fire. People raised in captivity are often taught to fear the world outside their cage. So she spoke quietly but firmly. "We are not lost. We were never lost." They only wanted us to believe that. One by one, heads lifted. That's the thing about dignity. You don't need to teach it. You only need to remove whatever tried to bury it. A ghost in the ashes. Meanwhile, Captain Domingos Foucault wandered to the smoking ruins of the big house, coughing and muttering to himself like a man trapped inside his own nightmare. He wasn't injured. The fire hadn't touched him, but something inside him had broken. Something he believed was unbreakable. Witnesses described him as a shadow of a man who believed he owned the sun. He searched the ashes for bits of his old world. A brass key, a burned ledger, a half-melted pocket watch. Useless things. He didn't look at the people he once commanded, not even once, because deep down, he understood something terrible. A man who loses everything he stole is not a victim. He is simply returned to the size he always was. The overseer's dilemma. The overseers, men who had once carried whips like extensions of their own bodies, now stood empty-handed, the fire illuminating the fear written across their faces. They weren't afraid of violence. They were afraid of accountability. One of them, a tall man with a scar down his cheek, dared to speak. So what now? The question wasn't for the free people of Rosario. It was for his fellow overseers, men who suddenly realized their authority had been nothing but borrowed cruelty. Aparecida walked past them without a glance, not as defiance, as dismissal. To her, they were already part of the past. And history does not look back for those who built their power on broken spines. A walk through the ruins. Before leaving, the community moved through Rosario one last time, not to check the damage, but to witness the truth. The mill where people had bled for sugar was gone. The house where decisions were made over suffering was gone. The storage rooms packed with cane and secrets were gone. And in their place was something surprisingly peaceful. Space. Space where pain had lived. Space where screams had settled in the walls. Space where names had been erased. The wind carried ash across the clearing, but even the ash felt lighter than the plantation had ever allowed itself to be. A young woman walked toward the burned foundations of the senzala. She touched the blackened earth and whispered, "This is the last time I kneel here." Then she stood up and didn't look back. The first steps away. When the moment finally came, there was no speech, no ceremony, no line to cross. People simply began to walk, some toward the coast, some toward distant towns, some toward forests where Quilambos still lived in silence. But every step had the same meaning. I choose my direction. A man carrying a newborn child paused and said to the group around him, "Do not forget this night. They will try to erase it, so we remember." Another woman, older, tired, but standing tall, added, "And we tell like fire, because fire tells the truth." Their footsteps formed a trail through the dark fields, hundreds of footprints leading away from a world that had finally burned out, what the newspapers would not print. Weeks later, when reporters arrived at the smoldering ruins, Captain Foucault told them the fire had been an accident, a spark, a tragedy, a misunderstanding. He claimed the enslaved people had panicked and fled without direction. None of that was true. But history is often written by the hands that shake less, not the hands that suffered more. Still, some journalists noticed odd details the captain couldn't explain. Why were the fields destroyed in perfect symmetry? Why were the chains found broken, not burned? Why did dozens of people leave without taking anything but their memories? One reporter, a man from Rio with sharp eyes, wrote a single sentence that nearly got him fired. It looked less like there's a question that history refuses to answer honestly. Where do the freed go on the morning after freedom? Not the legal answer, not the patriotic one, the human one. Because on May 14, 1888, the day after the flames at Ingenio do Rosario, hundreds of men, women, and children walked into a world that wasn't designed for them to survive. The law said they were free. The landowners said they were disposable. And the country said nothing at all. Silence, again, waiting to see who would speak first. The morning light, that didn't feel like celebration. At sunrise, the smoke over Rosario rose in long gray ribbons, stretching across the sky like torn pages. A few villagers from nearby towns approached cautiously, covering their mouths against the ash. They expected chaos. They expected violence. They expected a rebellion still burning. But what they found was something else entirely. Order, calm, purpose. The enslaved community had already gone hours before dawn, leaving behind nothing but footprints and the echo of a decision made together. One farmer, an older man who had seen too many changes to be impressed by most things, shook his head and whispered. They walked like people who already knew where they belonged. And then he added, almost as if confessing, "Not like us. The road splits. Freedom, in reality, doesn't come in one path. It comes in many, each risky. each uncertain. As the people of Rosario moved across the countryside, they gradually separated into small groups. Some followed the river toward the coast, believing work might be easier to find near the ports. Others walked inland, toward small communities where abolitionist priests or Colombo descendants welcomed them with open arms. Some simply followed the wind, trusting instinct more than geography, but all of them shared the same first fear. What if someone tries to take us back? Because freedom signed on paper is fragile. Freedom claimed in action is not. Aparecida, who walked to the front of one group, sensed their worry before anyone said a word. She stopped, turned around, and told them, if the world tries to close its hand on us again, it will grab only smoke. We left our chains in the fire. Those words moved through them like a steady heartbeat. People straightened their backs. Their steps grew firmer, and the forest seemed to open a little wider to let them through. Encounters on the road. On the second day of their journey, the group reached a small settlement known as Corrego Verde, a place where people lived quietly, suspicious of strangers but curious about everything. When they saw dozens of formerly enslaved people arriving together, barefoot, ash-covered, but standing tall, the townsfolk grew uneasy. Not hostile, just unsure. A local woman, Maria Hortensia, approached Aparecida and asked softly, what happened back there? Aparecida didn't give an easy answer. She didn't say a fire. She didn't say an accident. She simply replied, a past died. The woman nodded slowly, as if she understood more than Aparecida had spoken aloud. Then she offered them water. Real water. Clean water. One man from Rosario later said that the first sip tasted like permission to continue breathing. Meanwhile, the captain rewrites the story. Back at the remains of Ingenio do Rosario, Captain Domingos Falcao was doing what men like him had always done, turning truth into something that served him. To the authorities, he claimed the enslaved had misunderstood the new law. To neighboring plantations, he claimed he had tried to enforce order. To priests, he claimed a tragic accident had taken everything he owned. But here's the thing about lies. They need to stand on something that doesn't shake. And the ruins of Rosario shook every time the wind passed through them. People from other towns came to look at the ashes. Some stared in disbelief. Some nodded as if confirming a suspicion they'd carried for years. A young abolitionist journalist from Vitoria, a man named Joaquim Rubio, walked through the ruins and made a simple observation. Fire does not burn with that precision unless guided. The captain threatened to sue him, but Rubio wasn't intimidated. He wrote an article that would circulate quietly, whispered from person to person, town to town. Rosario did not fall. Rosario was released. The first night in freedom. That evening, far from the ruins, the people of Rosario sat in a clearing under a sky washed clean by the breeze. They ate what little they had gathered and shared more than food. Memories that had been too dangerous to speak aloud before. Names of relatives sold to faraway provinces. Songs that had been forbidden for generations. Dreams spoken as if tasting them for the first time. Someone began a soft rhythm on the small drum, rescued from a fire. Not a celebration, a heartbeat, a reminder. As the night deepened, Aparecida sat with the elders. One of them, a woman named Benedita, touched her arm and said, I saw you walking through the fire. You didn't look back. Aparecida replied, if I had looked back, I would have seen the life they wanted me to keep. I chose the one I hadn't lived yet. The elders nodded. No one said anything else. Sometimes agreement is a silence that feels like a blessing, the danger that still lurks. Freedom had arrived, but so had risk. Bounty hunters still roamed the countryside, angry that their business had vanished overnight. Some plantation owners whispered about taking back what was theirs, and groups of armed men rode to the night, searching for troublemakers who might inspire other plantations to rise. The people of Rosario weren't naive. They set watches. They walked quietly. They stayed close together. But they did not hide. Aparecida's words echoed among them. We burn what belonged to them, not what belongs to us. A message passed in shadows. On the fourth day of their journey, at dusk, a man approached them from the woods. He was thin, dust-covered, shaking from exhaustion. They almost didn't recognize him until he lifted his head. It was Antonio, one of the enslaved men who had vanished months before, presumed dead or captured. He had escaped to a hidden Quilombo deep in the mountains, and now he had returned with news. The Quilombo leaders know what happened. They're sending word to others. Your fire has reached places you've never seen. A collective breath moved through the group, fear mixed with pride. Antonio added, "They asked me to find you." They said, "Tell them they are not alone anymore." There are stories that travel fast, like sparks carried by the wind. And then there are stories that travel quietly, moving through forests, slipping between mountains, whispered from one survivor to the next until they reach the people who know exactly what to do with them. The news of Rosario's burning didn't march through the cities or get printed on elegant paper. It moved through the land itself, through roots, through rivers, through the footsteps of those who refuse to bow. That's how the Quilombos heard. Long before the government, long before the newspapers, long before Captain Foucault could invent a version of the story that made him look innocent. Freedom has a way of finding its own listeners. The mountains call. When Antonio brought the message from the Quilombo, the group fell silenti, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Quilombos were not legends to them. They were not mythical hideouts like the plantation owners like to claim. Quilombos were truth, flesh and bone. Entire nations carved out of exile, resistance, and stolen breath. Aparecida asked him, "Which Quilombo?" Antonio pointed toward the mountains, where the peaks formed a jagged crown against the dimming sky. "Quilombo de Serra Alta. They want us to meet them." The elders exchanged looks, tense, hopeful, uncertain. One of the younger men asked, "Will they take us in?" Antonio hesitated, not out of doubt, but respect. They will listen, and in these times, that is already a blessing. The path that tests the worth of every step. The road to Serra Alta was not really a road at all. It was a memory of one, twisting between giant boulders, climbing slopes that made lungs burn and legs tremble. A path designed to keep enemies out and the free alive. The climb forced everyone to confront something they had never been allowed to hold, their own rhythm. No overseer yelling orders, no bell ringing them awake, no voice commanding when to walk, when to stop, when to breathe. For the first time in their lives, their steps belonged to them. A young woman named Jacinta paused midway, chest heaving, and said, "It hurts, but it feels like a pain I choose." Aparecida smiled, not with joy, but with understanding. "That is the first kind of freedom," she replied, "the kind that reminds you you're alive." The forest around them seemed to pulse with the same rhythm, leaves trembling, branches swaying, the distant sound of water echoing through the hills. For the first time, the world didn't feel like a cage. It felt like company. The first signs of the hidden. Just before sunset, they saw it. Not a structure, not a flag, not a gate. A silence. A deep, intentional silence. The kind that surrounds places built by people who have every reason to stay unseen. Two figures emerged from between the trees. Both tall, both carrying spears carved from dark wood, both wearing expressions sharp enough to read every soul in the group. One of them spoke. "Who leads you?" Aparecida stepped forward, not because she wanted to lead, but because leadership had chosen her. "We come from Ingenio de Rosario," she said. "The fire was ours." The guards exchanged a quick glance, something between surprise and respect. And then they said the words no one expected. "We know." Inside Serra Alta. Serra Alta was not a village. It was not a camp. It was not a refuge. It was a nation carved into the mountain. Small houses made of clay and stone. Gardens grown on terraces cut into the hillside. Children running barefoot with more safety than any child born on a plantation had ever known. Elders sitting under wooden awnings, weaving baskets and telling stories in languages the empire had tried to erase. It was life, real, full, unapologetic life. When the people of Rosario walked in, the villagers didn't greet them with celebration. They greeted them with recognition. Because here, suffering wasn't a burden. It was a passport. The Council of the Mountain. At the heart of Serra Alta stood a longhouse built from thick wooden beams, its walls covered with symbols older than Brazil itself. Inside, the leaders of the Quilombo gathered, men and women, elders and fighters, healers and farmers. The eldest, a man named Mestre Lazaro, looked at Aparecida with steady, ancient eyes. "Tell us what happened," he said. Aparecida didn't tell it like a hero. She didn't tell it like a confession. She told it like someone who had lived too much to soften truth. She described the captain's refusal, the silence before the fire, the burning of the mill, the breaking of the chains, the walk into uncertainty. She did not embellish. She did not minimize. And when she finished, Mestre Lazaro leaned back and asked a question that would decide everything. Did you burn it out of vengeance? Or did you burn to be free? A hush filled the room. Aparecida answered without hesitation. Freedom does not need vengeance to guide its hand. We burn what was killing us, not what we loved. The council murmured, as if her words had echoed off the mountain itself, what the Quilombo saw in them. After a long silence, Mestre Lazaro spoke again. We have seen fires, many fires. Fires that consumed plantations, fires that swallowed forests, fires that lit battles. He studied them one by one, eyes sharp as flint. But the fire you carry, he continued, is not the kind that destroys. It's the kind that remembers. A young warrior at his side nodded. The Empire fears that fire more than rifles. Another elder, her voice rough but warm, added, "You burned a place that tried to erase you. You did not burn yourselves. That is rare. That is strength." The council rose, and as they did, Mestre Lazaro declared, "Serra Alta will shelter you, not as refugees, not as guests, as kin." Some of the Rosario survivors cried quietly, not from relief, but from the unfamiliar weight of being wanted. The words the government did not want spoken. Later that night, as fires burned safely in clay pits, Mestre Lazaro sat beside Aparecida and told her something she would never forget. Your fire has reached other Quilombos. Some are rising, some are preparing, some are watching. Aparecida asked, "Do you think there will be retaliation?" The elder sighed, as if carrying a centuries-old truth on his back. The government will pretend the abolition solved everything. Plantation owners will pretend the law is a betrayal, but neither of them will admit the real fear. Aparecida met his eyes. What fear? That the enslaved refused to wait for freedom, that you took it faster than they gave it, that you claimed it without permission. He added, almost in a whisper, freedom taken is far more dangerous than freedom granted. You would think that after a country ends slavery, the world would take a deep breath and finally let the truth rise to the surface. But Brazil in 1888 did something else. Something quieter, sharper, and far more familiar. It pretended that freedom came without chaos. It pretended that people who had been chained for centuries would simply fit into society the morning after. It pretended that white landowners would accept the golden law without resentment. Pretending can be a kind of violence too. And while the people of Rosario learned to breathe new air inside the Quilombo of Serra Alta, the world below was filling with rumors, dangerous rumors, about a fire that no one could fully explain. Whispers in town squares. In the villages surrounding Espírito Santo, the story of Rosario traveled in broken pieces. Some say the fire was revenge. Others say the slaves were tricked. I heard they were paid by abolitionists. My cousin said bandits did it. No, it was the free people themselves burning their own chains. Truth has never scared people as much as possibility. And the possibility that formerly enslaved people had united, decided, and acted for themselves, that possibility terrified landowners. Some reacted with fear, some with anger, some with a kind of panic. So quiet it sounded like politeness. One plantation owner, Senor Valverde, declared loudly, if we let this story spread, every mill in the province will burn by June. He wasn't wrong. But he said it as if that possibility were madness, not justice. The captain tries to rebuild his empire. Captain Domingos Falcao refused to accept that Rosario was gone. Every morning, he walked through the ashes with a notebook under his arm, sketching plans for rebuilding a new mill here, a stronger house here, move the workers' quarters to the far side. He spoke to the ruins like they owed him an apology, but something strange happened each time he tried to start construction. No one came, not laborers, not carpenters, not overseers. The workers of the region avoided Rosario as if the ground itself whispered warnings. The few who did show up refused to stay past sunset. "It feels wrong," one man said, like the place knows what happened. The captain called them superstitious fools. But even he couldn't ignore the truth. The earth where Rosario once stood had become a wound too deep to heal. A government that didn't want questions. When provincial officials finally came to investigate, their visit lasted less than a day. They walked through the ruins taking notes with stiff, careful hands. They asked the captain 3 questions, only 3, and then they concluded. Accidental fire, caused by agricultural dryness. No foul play, case closed. But the people who lived nearby knew better. They whispered the truth among themselves. They didn't want answers. They wanted silence. Because if the truth came out, that enslaved people had taken freedom into their own hands, the entire myth of a peaceful, orderly abolition would shatter. And Brazil was terrified of the shattering. Life begins to grow in Serra Alta. While the outside world tried to bury the truth, life inside Serra Alta grew in unexpected ways. Children played between the clay houses, shouting new names they had chosen for themselves. Young men and women learned the rhythms of farming, hunting, and planting, skills taught by elders who carried knowledge that had survived centuries of attempts at erasure. Women gathered herbs, seeds, and roots, passing down healing practices that the empire had declared witchcraft. Men carved tools, built shelters, repaired paths. Every night, shared fires lit up the longhouse, and under those flames, stories were exchanged like precious stones. A young boy from Rosario sat beside an elder and asked, "Why do the trees here feel different?" The elder smiled softly, "Because the trees here have never seen a whip." The boy didn't answer. He just touched the bark beside him, as if feeling a truth he had never known could exist, the pain that follows freedom. But freedom doesn't erase pain. It only lets it breathe. Some survivors woke in the middle of the night, shaking, gasping, unsure where they were. Some heard echoes of commands that no longer had power over them. Some walked to the edge of the terraces at dawn and cried, without knowing why. Aparecida noticed everything. She sat with those who needed company. She gave space to those who needed silence. One evening, she found Jacinta, the young woman who had spoken of choosing her pain, sitting alone, staring at the moon. "Do you miss anything from Rosario?" Aparecida asked. Jacinta laughed bitterly. "I missed a version of myself who thought freedom was simple." Aparecida nodded. "Freedom is the first step. Learning how to live after it, that's the real journey." Jacinta whispered, "And what if I'm not ready?" Aparecida placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "No one is. That's why we walk together." A threat waiting in the shadows. But far from the safety of Serra Alta, a danger was taking form. Not from the government, not from the captain, from men who lived between the law and the wilderness. Men who had hunted escaped slaves for decades and who refused to accept that their profession had ended. The Capangas de Mata, forest mercenaries, saw the burning of Rosario as a challenge, an insult, a signal that their services were still needed. And on the 10th day after the fire, one of their leaders, a man named Silverio, known for scars on his back from a whip fight, leaned over a tavern table and declared, "If the government won't punish them, we will." Rumors spread that they were tracking the Rosario survivors, that they had found footprints near the river, that they were moving toward the mountains. The world outside was closing its hand, and Serra Alta felt the shift in the wind. The Colombo prepares. Mestre Lazaro gathered the community under the moonlight. His voice was calm but firm. "The forest tells us hunters are moving, not for the land, for you." A hush fell over the longhouse. Aparecida stepped forward. "What do we do?" The elder answered simply, "If they come here, they will learn what the mountain has taught us, that freedom is not a gift, It is a stand. A young warrior added. They think we will run. They forget we are the ones who stayed. The entire Quilombo began to move, quietly, efficiently, with purpose older than anyone present. Paths were obscured, lookouts posted, traps set, children hidden, weapons sharpened. They were preparing not for war, but for protection, for the right to continue existing. There are moments in history when danger doesn't come as thunder. It comes as footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing to the ground long before you hear them with your ears. That's what Serra Alta felt on the 11th day. Not fear, not panic, a vibration, a warning. The kind the land gives only to those who know how to listen. The elders heard it first, then the hunters of the Quilombo, then the mothers, whose instincts shift like wind when danger approaches. Even the children fell quiet, sensing something the adults had not yet spoken aloud. The world outside was coming for them. The footsteps in the forest. The Kapangas de Mata weren't soldiers. They weren't outlaws. They were a strange mixture of both. Men who lived in the shadows between law and wilderness, hired for the worst kinds of work, and they moved through the forest like they had been born in it. Silverio, their leader, crouched near a bend in the river and touched the soil with 2 fingers. Fresh tracks, he muttered. The ones from Rosario passed through here. Another man asked, all of them. Silverio's eyes narrowed. No, a community that size doesn't travel without splitting. Some went north, but most are hiding somewhere close. One of the hunters grinned, a nervous grin. The kind men were when they're proud of cruelty they didn't earn. Then we finished what the fire didn't. Silverio didn't smile back. Don't underestimate people who burn their past with their own hands, he warned. They're not running, they're choosing. But warnings mean nothing to men who confuse arrogance with power. A watcher in the trees. What Silverio didn't know was that the forest belonged to Serra Alta long before he stepped into it. A young scout from the Quilombo, Bento, light-footed, sharp-eyed, had been following Kapanga since dawn. He moved between branches like a shadow with a heartbeat, watching their every step. When he saw Silverio kneel and examine the tracks, Bento realized something that chilled him. They're not guessing. They're tracking. He retreated silently, weaving through vines and roots until he reached the narrow stone path leading to Serra Alta. When he emerged from the forest, breath tight but controlled, the warriors were already waiting. Aparecida stood among them. What did you see? She asked. Bento answered with a single sentence. They're close. And that sentence was enough to change everything. The council in the longhouse. The longhouse filled quickly. Warriors, elders, farmers, mothers with infants wrapped to their chests. Young men and women who had never faced a battle but understood that survival sometimes writes its own requirements. Mestre Lazaro spoke first. The hunters approach. They believe we will scatter. A murmur rippled through the room. Aparecida stepped forward. And will we? The elder looked at her, eyes steady as stone. No, he said, we do not scatter. We stand. But standing didn't mean foolishly offering themselves as targets. Quilombo's strategy was older than any army in the region. One warrior explained, we fight like the land fights, quietly, from every direction, and without losing ourselves. Another added, we don't strike first, but we don't let them reach our children either. Apelin was forming, not a vengeance, but a protection, the mother's ritual. While the warriors prepared weapons, spears, slings, knives carved from old metal, the mothers of Serra Alta gathered the children in a circle. They painted small symbols of protection on the little ones' foreheads. A crescent moon for clarity, a line for strength, a dot for return. A tiny girl looked up at her mother and asked, are the bad men coming? Her mother kissed her hair. They don't know the mountain, she said softly, and they think the mountain doesn't know us. One of the elders added, but this land remembers every soul who found freedom here, and it will protect us as fiercely as we protect each other. For a moment, just a moment, fear loosened its grip. The hunters crossed the threshold. By late afternoon, Silverio and his men approached the outer perimeter of Serra Alta. They stopped when the trees began to thin, not because they were scared, but because something felt wrong. The air was colder, the ground firmer, the forest quieter. "Hear that?" one of the men whispered. Silverio frowned. "What?" "No birds, no insects." Silverio tested the weight of his machete. That means something is watching. He was right, but what he didn't know was that Serra Alta never allowed strangers to enter unseen. The first warning, just as the Capangas reached a narrow choke point in the trail, a small stone fell from above, landing near Silverio's boot. It wasn't thrown with force. It wasn't meant to injure. It was a message. Silverio looked up. A single figure stood on a high ridge. Bento, outlined by the fading sunlight. He didn't raise a weapon. He didn't shout. He simply stared at the hunters with the unmoving calm of someone who knows exactly where he stands. One of the Capangas growled, "Let's take him." But Silverio lifted a hand to stop them. "No," he said, "that's bait. They want us to think he's alone." He exhaled slowly. "This place isn't a hiding spot. It's a fortress. A decision in shadows. Down below, inside Serra Alta, Aparecida and Mestre Lazaro watched from a distance. Aparecida clenched her fists. "They're not turning back," she said. Lazaro nodded. "No, men like them don't turn back when pride guides their feet." She asked, "Should we evacuate the elders and children?" The elder shook his head. "No, if we scatter, they will hunt us one by one. We stay together." Aparecida swallowed hard. "Then what do we do?" Lazaro sighed, a long, ancient breath filled with memory. "We give them a choice." Aparecida frowned. "A choice?" The elder looked at the trees trembling in the wind. "Yes, a final one." The hunters stepped into a trap of truth. As the Capangas advanced, the forest shifted around them, not violently, but deliberately. Vines curled over the trail. Branches blocked shortcuts. Roots rose like warning fingers. The hunters slowed. Silverio stopped again. "This land is alive." One of his men scoffed. "It's just trees." Silverio didn't answer. He could feel it, a presence, ancient and patient, watching every step. Finally, he called out, "We know you're here. We're not here to kill everyone. We just want the ones from Rosario." A voice answered from the shadows. Not Bento, not a warrior. A voice older, a voice steady, a voice that belonged to Mestre Lazaro. "Then you want all of us," he said, "because here we're not divided." Silverio stiffened. "Come out and face us." The elder replied, "We already are facing you, just not on your terms." The forest had gone still, so still that even the smallest leaf seemed afraid to move. It wasn't silence, not exactly. It was a kind of listening, a tension that wrapped itself around every branch, every rock, every breath. The Capangas de Mata stood in a narrow clearing, weapons drawn, boots sinking slightly into the soft soil. But something felt wrong to them, a wrongness they couldn't name, only sense. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a threshold, and Serra Alta had chosen to stand on the other side of it. The elder steps forward. From between the trunks of the tall cedar trees, Mestre Lazaro emerged calm, steady, carrying no weapons. The Capangas tensed. Silverio lowered his machete a few centimeters. "You," he asked, "you're the one blocking the path?" Lazaro nodded slowly. "If a path leads to blood, it must be blocked." Silverio scoffed. "We're not here for you." "I know," the elder replied. "You came for the people who burned the Ingenio do Rosario." One of the Capangas spat on the ground. "They broke the law." Lazaro tilted his head, almost curious. "And which law is that? The law that kept them in chains? The law that turned children into property? The law that demanded silence from those who had already lost everything else?" Silverio's jaw clenched. "I'm not here to debate. I'm here to finish my job." "And I," the elder said softly, "am here to finish mine." A warning, not a threat. Lazaro raised his hand, not aggressively, not defiantly, but like someone stating a simple truth. This mountain shelters people whose lives have already burned once, he said. They will not burn again. Silverio stepped forward. We're taking them back. Lazaro shook his head. No, you are not. The Capangas shifted, gripping their weapons tighter. A few looked around nervously. The forest felt awake, alert, like an audience that knew exactly how the story should end. Silverio spat out. You think you can stop us? The elder's voice dropped gentle, but undeniably final. I think you have misunderstood who you are talking to. The shadow behind the elder. A rustling sound moved through the leaves. Then another, and another. From the shadows stepped 20 warriors of Serra Alta, men and women, each holding spears, bows, knives carved from centuries-old iron. They did not shout. They did not posture. They simply appeared, silent as memory, sharp as consequence. Silverio's men stiffened, realizing too late. They had walked into the center of a circle they could not see. Bento emerged from a branch above, landing on the ground as lightly as a bird. A line of warriors appeared behind Capangas, then to their left, then to their right, not surrounding them, containing them. Silverio swallowed hard. This wasn't supposed to be a trap. Lazaro answered. It wasn't one. You walked into a place that defends itself. Aparecida steps forward. From the far side of the clearing, Aparecida stepped toward the Capangas, her eyes steady, her posture unbroken. She held no weapon. Her presence was a statement all by itself. Silverio recognized her immediately. You, he said, you're the one they keep talking about. You led the burning. Aparecida didn't deny it. I helped free my people, she said. The fire did the rest. Silverio's grip on his machete tightened. You burned property. Aparecida's expression didn't move. We burned a lie. Silverio pointed toward her. You're coming with us. All of you from Rosario. Aparecida stepped closer, not frightened, not angry, but resolute. You have two choices, she said. Turn back, or become part of forest. The hunters muttered nervously. Some raised weapons. Others lowered them instinctively. Silverio growled. You think you have the right to threaten us? Aparecida's reply was as calm as the wind before a storm. It's not a threat. It's geography. The line in the soil. Mestre Lazaro bent down and drew a line in the soil with one finger, slowly, carefully, as if marking something sacred. This, he said, is the boundary of Serra Alta. The Capangas shifted uneasily. Silverio scoffed. A line in the dirt means nothing. Lazaro stood. To you, maybe, but to this land, to the people who survived here, to the blood buried beneath these roots. He looked Silverio directly in the eyes. Cross it, and the mountain judges you, not us. A shiver ran through the Capangas, though none admitted it aloud. Silverio stepped forward anyway, lifting his foot. For a moment, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The mountain answers. He crossed the line, and instantly, the forest reacted. A branch snapped above him, loud enough to startle even the bravest hunter. A cascade of leaves fell in a burst. The ground beneath his boot seemed to shift just a fraction, as if pushing back. Silverio froze, not because he was scared of trees, but because every instinct in his body screamed. This place does not want you. One of the Capangas grabbed his arm. This is a cursed place, he hissed. But Lazaro corrected him. No, this is a remembered place. The hunters retreat. Silverio glared at Aparecida. This isn't over. She nodded calmly. No, it's the beginning, but not the one you want. He looked at his men, shaken, sweating, suddenly aware that bravery and foolishness are not the same. And for the first time since arriving, Silverio hesitated. Then he stepped back over the line. His men followed quickly, not because they respected the Colombo, not because they feared defeat, but because the land had told them the truth. Some battles are already lost the moment you arrive. And Serra Alta was not a place where hunters remain hunters. It was a place where they became trespassers. A warning delivered. Before leaving, Silverio turned back toward the group. We'll return with soldiers, he said. Mestre Lazaro shook his head. No, you will not. You can't stop us. You misunderstand, the elder said softly. It is not we who will stop you. It is the world. Because every step you take from now on will repeat one truth inside your bones. That you met people who refused to kneel, Aparecida added, and that you left standing only because we allowed it. Silverio swallowed hard. Then he turned and disappeared into the forest, his men following closely. Like shadows trying to outrun their own fear, the forest didn't relax after the hunters left. It didn't sigh with relief or loosen its branches like someone unclenching a tired fist. Instead, it held its breath, watching, waiting, because danger doesn't disappear just because it turns around. Sometimes, danger is a seed, something that grows in the dark long after the feet that planted it are gone. And Serra Alta knew that the threat wasn't over. Not yet, not even close. The return to Quilombo. When the warriors and elders walked back into the heart of Serra Alta, they did so without cheering. There were no shouts of victory, no songs of triumph. Victory wasn't the goal. Survival was. And survival doesn't celebrate prematurely. Aparecida felt the weight of the moment settle over her shoulders, like a mantle she had never asked for but could no longer deny. Children ran to their mothers. Young men pulled the dust from their clothes. The elders murmured prayers in 3 languages, Portuguese, Kimbundu, and the quiet tongue of the forest. Mestre Lazaro sat down slowly, bones creaking with age, and whispered, "The world has seen us now." Aparecida met his gaze. "Then what do we do?" The elder gave a tired smile. "What we have always done. Keep living." In the distance, a storm that isn't weather. Silverio and his men reached the nearest village by sunset, exhausted and shaken. The villagers noticed immediately. These were hunters, men who usually walk with pride in their chests and cruelty in their hands. But today, they resembled something else entirely. Men who had seen a truth they didn't understand. A tavern keeper approached cautiously. "What happened? You look like you fought a ghost." Silverio slammed a hand on the counter. "Not a ghost," he growled. "A mountain." The tavern keeper frowned. "A mountain?" Silverio downed a cup of cachaca in one swallow. "A mountain that listens. A mountain that warns you. A mountain that stands with those people." "Which people?" Silverio met his eyes. "The ones who burned Rosario." A murmur swept through the tavern. Everyone had heard the rumors, but hearing that the survivors were alive and protected turned rumors into something far more dangerous. Possibility. The myth begins to take shape. 2 days later, whispers spread across the Espírito Santo. "Did you hear? The Rosario slaves didn't run. They joined the Quilombo." "No, not just any Quilombo. Serra Alta, they say the mountain spoke. They say the hunters were surrounded by shadows. They say no one can reach that place unless the land allows. For plantation owners, the whispers became fear. For abolitionists, they became hope. For workers, farmers, and free black communities, they became a spark, a reminder that freedom wasn't just a law passed in Rio. It was happening. It was alive. It was spreading. And nothing scares power more than freedom that multiplies. The government responds with silence. When rumors reach Victoria, officials met behind closed doors. A thin, nervous man in a stiff suit read from a report. "Arson by formerly enslaved individuals has caused the destruction of Ingenio do Rosario. The perpetrators have fled." Another official scoffed. "Fled?" They formed a settlement. A large one. A silence followed. Finally, the governor spoke. "We cannot act publicly. The country is unstable. The golden law is barely dry. But we can't let this spread. Then we contain it silently." The room chilled. Containment meant one thing. Not justice. Not reconciliation. Control. A younger officer raised a trembling question. "And if the Quilombo resists?" Everyone knew the answer. No one spoke it. A new kind of fear takes root. Back in Serra Alta, people returned to their routines, but the air had changed. Men sharpened tools each morning, even if they didn't need them. Women taught children to walk quietly through the forest, not just across the terraces. At night, fires were kept small, tiny points of light instead of roaring flames. Aparecida watched it all with a growing ache. She had never wanted to lead anything. She only wanted freedom for her people. But freedom, she realized, demands guardianship. One night, while watching the moon rise between the mountains, she asked Bento, "Do you ever get tired of being alert?" He shrugged. "Alert is the price of being alive." She sighed. "Sometimes I wish we could simply be alive." Bento looked at her, really looked, and said, "That's why we fight. So maybe one day, someone else won't have to be." The elders remember what the young have never known. In the longhouse, the elders gathered, voices low and steady. Benedita, the oldest among them, stirred a pot of herbal tea and said, "We have seen this before." Lazaro nodded. "Yes, after every liberation comes a tightening. After every step forward, a hand tries to pull us back." Another elder whispered, "But this time is different." "How?" "Because this time they lost something they thought they owned forever." The room grew quiet. The truth lingered heavy in the air. That fire, Benedita said softly, did not burn a house. It burned certainty. Rumors become a beacon. Within a week, people began arriving at Serra Alta, a runaway child from a nearby plantation, a pregnant woman who had overheard her former master planning to sell her infant, a man with scars crisscrossing his back like a map of survival, a family who simply said, "We heard this is where freedom breeds." Each arrival brought new stories, stories the world wanted to forget, stories of Colombo refused to bury. Aparecida welcomed them all, though fear tugged at her chest each time a new group crossed the ridge. Every person who entered was another soul to protect, another life to guard, another reason for the world outside to fear Serra Alta. And yet, she could not turn them away. Freedom is not freedom if it has a door that can close. The hunters are not done. Meanwhile, Silverio was gathering strength. Not courage, not justice. Strength. He went from plantation to plantation, whispering poison into the ears of angry landowners. They burned Rosario. Who's next? Yours. Money changed hands. Promises were made. Grievances were stirred. Within a few days, Silverio had what he needed, a small militia, not official, not legal, but determined. The kind of men who mistake cruelty for order. The kind of men who believe their fear is a righteous cause. The kind of men who would rather burn a mountain than let it shelter the free. The forest warns them again. Back in Serra Alta, Bento sensed something shift. Not sound, not sight, a scent. Smoke? No, not yet, but something like intention. Something like footsteps carried on the wind before the feet themselves arrived. He ran to Aparecida. "They're coming again," he said. She didn't ask who. She didn't ask how many. She only asked, "How long do we have?" Bento looked toward the horizon. Dawn hadn't even touched the horizon when Serra Alta felt the first tremor of what was coming. Not an earthquake, not thunder, not horses. A heartbeat of men marching with a kind of purpose that has nothing to do with justice and everything to do with fear wrapped in violence. The mountain listened. The trees straightened. The air thickened. A kind of message moved through the branches. Prepare. Aparecida felt it before anyone said a word. She woke with her pulse racing, as if something unseen had tugged her spirit upright. When she stepped outside her clay house, Bento was already waiting. "They're close," he said. She didn't ask how he knew. No one in Serra Alta needed to explain how they sensed danger. Danger announced itself the way a storm announces itself to birds. Quietly, naturally, unmistakably, the mountain's routine changes. Serra Alta didn't panic. Panic is what powerless people feel. The people of Serra Alta had already burned one world and stepped into another. Instead of fear, something else took hold. Focus. Mothers pulled their children close. whispered instructions in their ears, and guided them toward hidden hollows beneath the terraces. Hunters sharpened their spears and tested their bows. Warriors wrapped their feet to move soundlessly. Elders collected herbs and roots, not just to heal wounds, but to calm fear, sharpen breath, and steady the heart. Everyone had a role, even silence, a warning delivered by wind. By mid-morning, a wind swept through the valley, cooler than it should have been, carrying dust that didn't belong to the mountain. Bento tasted it on his tongue. Riders, he said, more than before. Aparecida closed her eyes for a brief moment. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of losing the people who had survived too much to fall now. She walked to Mestre Lazaro's longhouse. The elder was already waiting at the doorway, hands clasped behind his back. "Tell me," she said. He did, in the simplest possible way. "They will arrive before night. And what do we do?" The elder looked at her with eyes that had lived through too many wars to be naive. "We give them a truth they cannot carry." The militia advances. Far below the mountain, in the thick brush near the riverbed, Silverio led a group of armed men, more than before, heavier, angrier, and louder, rifles on their shoulders, machetes at their hips, shotguns tied across their backs. Not forest hunters anymore. A militia, the kind that forms when fear convinces cruelty it has a purpose. Silverio raised a hand and halted the group. "Remember what I told you," he said. "They're organized, they're protected, and the land is on their side." One man laughed. "A land doesn't take sides." Silverio glared at him. "Then you haven't met this one." He pointed toward the ridge. "That mountain keeps secrets, and today we uncover them. A decision to stand." Back inside Serra Alta, Aparecida gathered the Rosario survivors. They surrounded her, faces tense, eyes wide but steady. One of the younger men asked, "Will they kill us?" Aparecida didn't lie. She never had. "They might," she said, "but they will not take us. Not alive, not as property, not as ghosts of the world we left behind." Another man asked, "Should we hide with the children?" Aparecida shook her head. "No, we hide the helpless. We hide the innocent, but we stand for ourselves." A quiet murmur spread through the group. Not fear, recognition. Something had brought them into the fire once before. Now something was calling them to stand on the other side of that fire. A new kind of courage. The elders prepared the mountain's answer. At the longhouse, the elders formed a circle. They spread leaves, resin, crushed bark, and fragrant flowers across the ground, reading a mixture who sent rows and spirals. Benedita whispered, "This mountain responds to intention." "And ours?" Lazaro asked. She answered without hesitation, "To live." Her voice carried no weakness. Intentions shape outcomes. And Serra Alta was a place built on intention, a ritual older than the empire. A drum started, soft, deep, ancient, not a song of war, a song of grounding, a song that told the forest, "We are here, we are united, we are not moving." Warriors of Serra Alta joined hands. Men, women, children old enough to understand. Even the wounded. A collective breath rose. A collective truth settled. A collective line was drawn, not in soil this time, in resolve. The militia reaches the boundary. By late afternoon, Silverio's militia reached the edge of the forest. He held up a hand again. "Slow," he said. "They will expect us." The men spread out, stepping over roots and ducking under low branches. It didn't take long for them to realize something unsettling. There were no birds. Again, no insects. Again, no wind. The forest was waiting. And waiting always means something is watching. A younger soldier whispered, "It's too quiet." Another responded, "Quiet for them, maybe, not for us." Silverio's jaw tightened. "They're near." The mountain speaks first. When the militia reached the narrow trail leading upward, a sound echoed down from the ridge. Not a war cry, not a shout, a single drumbeat. Deep, slow, final. It reverberated through the bones of the mountain. Silverio halted his men. "What was that?" Bento stepped into view on a ledge above them, silhouette framed by dying sunlight. He didn't look like a warrior. He looked like a warning. "You were told not to return," he called out. Silverio barked back. "We're not leaving without them." Bento didn't flinch. "Then you will not leave." A ripple of fear moved through the militia, a line that cannot be crossed. Aparecida appeared beside Bento. Her presence alone commanded stillness. She raised her voice, not shouting, but filling the air with something unmistakably human. "We are not running. We are not hiding. We are not returning to the world that decided we should never exist." Silverio stepped forward. "This ends today." Aparecida nodded. "Yes, but not the way you think." Behind her, dozens of Serra Alta warriors emerged, silent, steady, immovable. Behind the warriors, the elders stood. Behind the elders, the Rosario survivors. Behind them all, the mountain, a wall of presence, a wall of will, a wall of history that refused to die quietly. The standoff begins. Silverio lifted his rifle. Aparecida didn't move. Bento didn't move. None of Serra Alta moved. Silence stretched so tightly it could snap. But before anything could break, before fear could transform into violence, before the militia could advance, the ground beneath their boots shifted. Just enough to be unmistakable. Just enough to say, "Not here, not today, not by force." The mountain had decided, and the men carrying hatred in their weapons felt it. Some stepped back, some gripped their guns tighter, some blinked, unsure if the earth had actually moved. Silverio whispered, "What is this place?" Aparecida answered, "A place where freedom learned how to defend itself." Every great confrontation in history begins with a single second, a second when everyone involved tries to decide whether courage outweighs fear. At the entrance of Serra Alta, that second stretched into something larger than time itself. The militia stood in rigid formation, rifles raised, breaths uneven. The people of Serra Alta stood in unwavering stillness, eyes calm, chests lifted, not out of arrogance, but belonging. Between them, the mountain held the air like a clenched fist, and then came the tremor, soft, barely noticeable, but unmistakably real, a trembling that moved through the soil, into soles, into bone, the kind of trembling that doesn't come from footsteps or thunder, a trembling that feels like the earth thinking. Men in the militia froze. A few whispered, "Did you feel that?" "What was that?" "God help us." Silverio clenched his jaw. "Don't lose your nerve," he snapped. But even he couldn't hide the crack in his voice. Because this wasn't fear of people. This was fear of place. The first shot that never reached its target. One of the militiamen, young, jittery, desperate to end the tension, raised his rifle without waiting for orders. He fired. The crack of gunpowder tore through the air like a violent exclamation. The bullet flew, but before it reached the ridge, a tree branch snapped downward, intercepting it with a sharp, impossible thud. The bullet ricocheted harmlessly into the dirt. A hush fell over the clearing. The young soldier stared at the branch, trembling. I didn't miss. Something moved. Silverio glared, but the glare was forced, hollow. Everyone had seen it. The branch did move, and not by wind. The forest tells the first story. Aparecida stepped forward, her hands empty, her voice steady enough to feel like truth carved into stone. "No one here wishes for blood," she said, "but we will not walk back into chains." Behind her, the Rosario survivors stood shoulder to shoulder. The same people who had burned their past to create a future none of them had ever dared to imagine. Silverio pointed his machete toward them. "You're not free," he snarled. "You're fugitives." Aparecida didn't look away. "We were fugitives the moment we were born under someone else's name." Then the forest answered for her. A deep creaking sound rolled through the trees. Branches leaned, almost imperceptibly, as if turning their faces toward the militia. The mountain shifted again, not violently, but with purpose. The kind of purpose that shakes certainty, not bodies. The elders stepped into the open. Mestre Lazaro and Benedita walked to stand beside Aparecida. Their presence was a lesson in itself. Age that had survived 3 generations of bondage, eyes that had seen the worst and still found reason to look forward. Benedita lifted her chin. "If you fire again," she said, "you will not be shooting at people." Silverio barked a laugh. "Oh, then who are we shooting at?" She answered with calmness that struck deeper than any shout. "At history, and history always buries the ones who shoot first." A ripple of unease spread through the militia ranks, the children hidden in the mountain's veins. Beneath the terraces, in tunnels carved naturally by roots and stone, the children huddled together, not in fear but in unity. Older children whispered to the younger ones, "Don't cry. They'll protect us. The mountain doesn't let bad men in." A little girl clutched a wooden doll saved from the ruins of Rosario and asked, "Will Mama come back?" Another child, barely older, held her hand. "Mama's not alone. The whole mountain is with her." Their voices didn't shake, because children born in struggle understand something adults often forget. Safety isn't silence. Safety is presence. And Serra Alta was present. The militia tries to advance. Despite the tremors and whispers and the eerie stillness of the forest, Silverio forces men forward. "Advance!" he shouted. But the order fell flat. Only a few took steps. Their boots sank deeper than before, as if the earth itself refused their weight. A man at the back stumbled and cursed. "I can't, the ground keeps shifting." Another chimed in, "It's the roots. They're grabbing me." Silverio growled, "Cowards, up the trail." Then he tried to climb the first incline himself. He took one step, then another, but on the third, his foot sank into the soil as if stepping into a muddy trap. He yanked his leg, confused. It wasn't mud. It was resistance. The mountain wasn't swallowing him. It was rejecting him. The first warrior moves. One of Serra Alta's warriors, Lua Morena, tall, fierce, with braids cascading down her back, moved the edge of the ridge. She didn't raise a weapon. She raised her voice. Not loudly, not aggressively, but with weight. "If you wish to test your strength," she said, "test it against the living, not the land." Silverio spat. "We outnumber you." Lua Morena tilted her head. "You don't." For a split second, the militia didn't understand. Then the forest rustled. More warriors appeared behind the trees. More shadows took shape between boulders. More figures stepped from the brush. Dozens, 50, maybe more. Silent, steady, real. The militia had thought they were tracking fugitives. They had no idea they were approaching a community, a nation, a truth the militia cannot bear. Silverio's face changed, not into fear. Fear can be hidden, but into recognition. The recognition of a man realizing that he had not come to hunt prey. He had come to confront people who had decided never to submit again. He shouted, "You can't win. If we fall, more will come." Aparecida stepped forward until she stood at the very edge of the ridge. Her voice carried with absolute clarity. "We do not need to win. We only need to stay human." Then, like a deep exhale breaking through the clouds, the mountain trembled a third time. This one stronger, more deliberate. It traveled through root and rock and bone. A warning, no longer subtle. Something breaks in the militia. The youngest man in the militia dropped his rifle. "I'm not dying here," he whispered. Another backed away. "Something's wrong. We shouldn't be here." A third crossed himself. "This place isn't ours." Silverio snapped, "Stand your ground." But they didn't, not because they were cowards, but because they understood something Silverio didn't. When a land declares who belongs, it also declares who does not, and the militia did not belong. The moment before the choice, Silverio lifted his rifle one last time. "You either surrender," he said, "or we burn this entire mountain." Aparecida inhaled sharply, but not in fear, in decision. "Then listen carefully," she said, and the entire mountain seemed to lean in. "We did not flee the fire once. We will not flee it twice." Her final words were a knife of truth. You cannot burn what refuses to die. Silverio hesitated, for the first time, because he realized something terrifying. They meant it, all of them. Every face staring back at him was willing to stand, to fight, to fall if necessary. Not for land, not for pride, for existence. There's always a point, in every struggle, in every uprising, in every story where impossible people refuse to vanish, where the air becomes so heavy that even breath feels like a decision. Serra Alta had reached that point. The militia stood trembling on the lower trail, pressed between fear and pride. The warriors of Serra Alta held their ground on the ridge, pressed between survival and memory, and somewhere in the invisible space between them, the future took shape like a blade still cooling from a forge, the spark before the storm. Silverio's rifle shook in his hands, not from weakness, not from indecision, from a realization he had never expected to feel. He was outnumbered by something he could not measure, not people, not weapons, conviction. Behind him, his men muttered, "We shouldn't be here. This isn't right. The land doesn't want us." One man finally shouted, "Silverio, look at them. They're not breaking." But Silverio refused to turn around. He knew that if he looked into Aparecida's eyes again, he would see something that terrified him far more than death. Unbroken humanity. "Quiet," he snapped. "We finish this now." And with that, he raised his rifle again. A breath that changes everything. Aparecida didn't look at the weapon. She looked at him, not with hatred, not with fear, not with vengeance, with a kind of clarity that belongs to people who already died once and learned something from it. She whispered a single sentence, so soft that only Bento and Lua Morena heard it. Let him choose his ending. The words were not permission. They were prophecy. Because freedom makes you responsible for your choices. But oppression? Oppression makes you responsible for your endings. Silverio took half a step closer. The mountain vibrated in warning beneath his heel, the fire inside the drums. At that exact moment, in the heart of Serra Alta, the elders struck the drums again. Once, twice, a third time. But this rhythm wasn't grounding. It was awakening, a pulse, a heartbeat, a memory older than Brazil itself. Smoke from herbal braziers curled upward, spinning in strange spirals as if carried by an unseen hand. Benedita whispered, "Let the mountain see clearly." The fires flickered, waxing, waning, shifting in color. Amber, gold, red. The flames didn't grow taller. They grew aware when the forest moves. On the ridge, a gust of wind swept past Aparecida, carrying with it the scent of burning resin from a longhouse. Silverio scowled. "What is that smell?" Aparecida answered, "Memory." The word didn't make sense to him, but the forest understood. Leaves began to fall, one by one, though there was no breeze. Roots trembled beneath the soil. Branches creaked like old bones remembering how to stand. The militia tightened their grips on their weapons, but the weapons suddenly felt small, irrelevant, ridiculous. Bento whispered, "It's beginning." A line drawn by fire. Without warning, a burst of flame erupted, not toward the militia, not toward the people of Serra Alta, but across the trail between them. A thin line of fire, perfectly straight, perfectly controlled, perfectly deliberate. The militia stumbled backward in confusion. "What is that? Where did it come from?" "It's witchcraft." But Mestre Lazaro, still standing in the longhouse miles uphill, whispered to the fire he had tended, "No, it is remembering." Aparecida stepped forward. "That fire," she said, "is the same fire that burned Rosario, the same fire that freed us, the same fire that refuses to die." Silverio's eyes widened. You're doing this?" Aparecida shook her head. "Fire does not belong to us, but we belong to it. The mountain offers a choice." Lua Morena raised her spear, not to threaten, but to point. "You can turn back now," she said, "and the mountain will let you leave." Bento added, "But if you cross that fire, the mountain will treat you the same way Rosario treated us." Silverio spat angrily. "You speak in riddles." "No, Aparecida said softly. We speak in consequences. The militia felt the heat of the fire, not burning, not painful, but decisive. A boundary, a question. Silverio stepped toward it, but his men grabbed his arms. Don't, one pleaded. It's not worth it. They're not slaves anymore. They're people. Silverio ripped his arms free. They're nothing. Those words cracked something in the air, something invisible but real. A thunderous rumble rolled down the mountain. A warning, a verdict, a promise, the moment of collapse. Silverio lunged forward, desperate to save the pride he mistook for authority. He tried to jump the line of fire. That was his mistake, because fire does not stay still for arrogance. As he leapt, the flame rose, not tall but wide, forcing him to fall backward into the dirt. He scrambled, stunned, and the fire lowered again, returning to its straight, quiet boundary. Aparecida didn't move. She simply said, You've had your answer. The militia breaks. One by one, Silverio's men dropped their weapons, not out of fear of Serra Alta, not out of fear of fire, out of fear of themselves, fear of what they had almost done, fear of what they had become, fear of what the world was turning them into. One man fell to his knees. Another whispered, I can't fight a people who stand like this. Another sobbed softly, ashamed. Silverio stared at them in disbelief. Cowards, all of you. But none lifted their weapons. And that is the moment a man realizes he is alone. The final word. Silverio backed away from the fire, eyes wide with rage and confusion. This isn't over, he shouted. Aparecida answered him for the last time. It is for you. He hesitated, the truth unbearable. Then he turned and fled into the forest, his remaining men stumbling after him, tripping over roots, scrambling like frightened animals chased by nothing but their own reflection. Serra Alta watched them go, not with triumph, with recognition. Because freedom isn't proven in victory. Freedom is proven saying that Serra Alta needed to choose its future was easy. Living that choice was something else entirely. A refuge can survive for decades. But a beacon demands purpose, demands courage, demands the most difficult decision of all, to be seen. And at dawn the next morning, Serra Alta woke different, as if the air had shifted, as if the wind carried new questions, as if the shadows waited for new answers. There was no more what now. There was what next. The first light of a new kind of morning. Aparecida rose before sunrise. She hadn't slept much, hardly anyone had, but something in her chest wasn't fear or pain or weight. It was direction. She climbed to the highest terrace, where the view reached valleys, rivers, trails carved by wind and memory. She tried to imagine a future there. A future where children didn't have to hide, where mothers didn't fear the sound of hooves at night, where men and women didn't carry scars like surnames. A future where Serra Alta wasn't just a place, but a voice. Bento approached quietly, his footsteps soft as always. You should be resting, he said. She smiled faintly. Rest? After yesterday? How? He didn't argue. He hadn't slept either. Lazaro is calling for you, he said. The community wants to speak. It was time. The assembly that would change an entire mountain. The main clearing was full, and it didn't feel like a simple meeting. It felt like something being born. Men with spears, women carrying children, the Rosario survivors, recent refugees, elders whose eyes carried stories too heavy for a single lifetime. Aparecida entered, and the murmuring fell silent, not out of hierarchy, out of respect. Mestre Lazaro stood slowly, his presence still a pillar. Today, he began, we must decide not who we are, but who we will become. Aparecida swallowed. Responsibility pressed on her like hot iron. Yesterday, Lazaro continued, the mountain protected us. But no mountain protects forever. A heavy silence settled. Benedita across her arms, rooted, grounded. If we hide, we win a battle, she said. But we lose the world. 2 proposals, 2 paths. Aparecida spoke first. I propose, she said, that Serra Alta prepared itself to grow, to be more than a hiding place, to be a home for anyone who escapes, a place where no one lives in fear again. Some smiled, some frowned. Lua Morena stepped forward. "I propose something else," she said. "We send emissaries to distant Quilambos, to free villages, to scatter black communities living unprotected, to tell them we are no longer hiding." The clearing buzzed with energy. It was bold, it was risky, it was revolutionary. Aparecida crossed her arms, absorbing the reaction. "And you all understand," she said, "that this means there is no going back, that we will no longer be just a Quilambo, but a symbol." The silence that followed was full of weight and desire, the ghost that must be buried. A tall man with tired eyes raised his hand. His name was Vicente, a former enslaved man who had lost his wife during a failed escape years earlier. "Aparecida," he said, "if we spread out, they will come after us harder." "I know," she replied, "and if we bring more people, we'll have more mouths to feed, more arms to teach, more lives to protect." "I know. And what if the army comes? Not just hired men, but soldiers?" Aparecida took a deep breath. Then she said the sentence that split the clearing open. "We have been alive, but we have not been living." The words landed like a seed cracking open the earth. When a community decides to breathe, Benedita placed a hand on Aparecida's shoulder. "Her words," she said, "do not come from pride. They come from the exhaustion of surviving in the dark." She looked around, eyes gleaming with sunrise. "I have seen Quilambos die hidden, and I have seen Quilambos live because they dared to exist. The question is not whether they will come after us. The question is whether we will be ready when they do." Lua Morena lifted her chin. Freedom doesn't grow in silence. It grows in the light. And then something unexpected happened. A child's voice rose above the crowd. "I don't want to hide anymore," said a boy of 8. "I want to run in the sun." The impact was immediate. Some cried, some smiled, some closed their eyes as if struck by truth. The unanimous decision. At last, Mestre Lazaro lifted his hands. All in favor of Serra Alta becoming more than a home, more than a refuge, all in favor of Serra Alta becoming a flame no one could extinguish. Hands rose. Many. All. Aparecida felt her chest tighten, not from fear, but from purpose. Bento murmured. Then it settled. Now it begins. The first plans for a future no one believed possible. Aparecida inhaled deeply and began organizing thoughts aloud. "We'll need messengers," she said. "Safe trails, warning signals, additional shelters, training for children to move with the land. Allies," Lua Morena added, "and watch your station across the mountain. The next attack won't be from lost men. It will be from determined men." Benedita smiled with both sorrow and pride. "Then let them come determined, because we will be alive." The clearing filled with murmurs of agreement. Aparecida felt something new rise within her. Not leadership, not authority, direction. One last sign from the mountain. When the meeting ended, the wind shifted suddenly, cold, enveloping deep. The leaves rustled as if greeting them. And on the hilltop, a single column of sunlight broke through clouds and illuminated Serra Alta. No lightning, no thunder, just light. Aparecida lifted her face, closed her eyes, and felt. The mountain accepted the decision. And now, the world would have to accept it too. The decision had been made. Serra Alta would no longer be a secret, no longer a shadow hidden between ridges, no longer a rumor spoken only in whispers. It would become something else, something dangerous to empires, something terrifying to oppressors, something unforgettable, a living declaration that freedom does not fade when ignored. And the moment that decision settled over the mountain, everything changed, not by magic, not by fire, but by movement, human movement, purposeful movement, the kind that shapes history before anyone realizes it is happening. The day Serra Alta began to prepare. At sunrise, people who had never seen themselves as leaders began acting like ones. Men who once cut cane for others now built defensive terraces. Women who once hid in slave quarters now organized supply routes and training circles. Children who once whispered stories in the dark now ran to the open sun, learning how to read the forest like a second language. Even the sound of work was different, not the tired rhythm of forced labor, but the steady heartbeat of preparation, the preparation of a people who had decided they would not die forgotten, the watchers of the four directions. Bento organized the scouts. He divided them into 4 groups: North Wind Watchers, to observe the trails from the river; Stone Ridge Watchers, to watch the cliffs where the militia first appeared; Deep Forest Watchers, to guard against ambushes from the dense interior; Skyview Watchers, positioned on the tallest peaks, able to signal danger long before footsteps could be heard. Each scout carried only 3 things: a knife, a hollow reed whistle for coded signals, and knowledge of the terrain carved into their instincts. Bento trained them personally. He taught them how to vanish behind a single tree, how to navigate stone without leaving footprints, how to listen for unnatural silence, because danger almost never announces itself with noise. One teenage scout, lean and fast, asked him, "What if they come at night?" Bento answered with the calm of someone who knows suffering intimately. Night belongs to those who know how to see without eyes, and that is us. The council plans the first outreach. While the scouts organized, the elders and warriors gathered again. This time, the atmosphere was differente, not fearful, but determined. Aparecida stood near the longhouse wall, listening as Lua Morena laid out possibilities. "We need 3 groups of emissaries," Lua said. "1 for the northern Quilambos, 1 for the coastal communities, and 1 for the free black settlements forming near Victoria." Benedita nodded. "And each group must travel quietly, not to hide, but to avoid being intercepted before the message spreads." Aparecida added, "And the message must be the same everywhere." She spoke slowly, choosing each word as though engraving them into stone. "You are not alone. You have a place if you need one. If you want to stand, we stand with you." The elders murmured in agreement. It was not a call to war. It was a call to existence. And sometimes existence is the most revolutionary call of all. The buried fear. Even as they prepared, fear lingered. Not loud fear, not chaotic fear. Quiet fear, the kind that creeps into the mind when hope grows too large. Vicente approached Aparecida. During a brief pause, he carried a worry in his eyes that had nothing to do with the militia. "Do you think," he asked, "that others will join us?" Aparecida studied him. "Yes," she said, "but not all at once. Some will be afraid. Some will be cautious. Some will wait to see if we survive the first attack." Vicente swallowed hard. "And what if we don't?" Aparecida answered without hesitation. "Then we will fall standing, and that will be enough to light the next flame." He exhaled almost painfully. "You speak like you've already seen the future." She shook her head. "No, I speak like someone who refuses to repeat the past." Children learn the land, while adults planned and trained. The children of Serra Alta began learning something ancient, how to disappear into nature without losing themselves. Older teenagers taught younger ones to walk barefoot without snapping branches, recognize animal calls from human imitations, climb natural ladders in the rock walls, use a hollow gourd to carry water silently, find edible roots even with eyes closed. One child asked Lua Morena, "Why do we have to learn all this if we're free now?" Lua Morena put a gentle hand on the child's head. "Because freedom without knowledge is a door without a path." The child blinked, absorbing more than the words themselves. The longhouse prepares a fire. Benedita and the elders gather herbs, oils, and wood from specific trees, ones with meanings older than Portuguese, older than the colony, older than the empire. They arranged everything in the center of the longhouse. Aparecida approached. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. Benedita answered, "Preparing memory." Aparecida frowned. "For what?" "For the moment," Benedita said, "when we will need the mountain to see clearly again." Aparecida understood. The fire that had risen before was not accidental. It was connection, recognition, and connection must be fed. The emissaries are chosen. By late afternoon, the names were selected. 6 emissaries, 2 for each path. A young woman named Jacinta, who had once whispered she wasn't ready for freedom, volunteered for the Northern Trail. A man named Lorenzo, known for his strength and silence, joined a coastal group. 2 siblings who had grown up enslaved in Rosario asked to go to Victoria's free settlements. "We know the road," they said. "We know the dangers. We will not break." Aparecida placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "You leave at dawn," she told them, "and you return only when you are safe." They nodded, but their eyes said a truth that words didn't dare. If we don't return, let the message live anyway. Night falls on a community that has stopped hiding. As night approached, a quiet hum of activity moved across Serra Alta. Warriors sharpened blades. Elders murmured blessings. Children practiced hand signals in the shadows. The watchers took their positions on the ridges. And Aparecida stood at the center of it all, feeling the weight of a future that wasn't promised, but was being built brick by brick, step by step. Bento joined her. "You think they'll come soon?" he asked. "Yes." "And you think we're ready?" Aparecida watched the firelight reflect off the determined faces around her. "No," she answered honestly, "but we will be." She looked toward the dark forest, sensing something beyond sight, a shift in the wind, a hunger in the world, a question waiting to be asked. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "we start walking into the world." Bento nodded slowly. "And the world," he said, "will have to decide what to do with us." Aparecida exhaled. "No," she corrected gently. "We will decide what to do with the world." Dawn rose differently that day. Not quietly, not softly, not with its usual gentle warmth. It rose like a drumbeat, steady, unavoidable, calling everyone awake with the weight of a new beginning. The emissaries of Serra Alta were about to take their first steps beyond the mountain protection. No one said aloud, but everyone understood. The moment they crossed the ridge, Serra Alta would no longer be just a place. It would become a message carried by human footsteps, stitched into trails, whispered in new ears and planted in distant hearts. A message that no empire had ever been prepared to face. Before departure, Aparecida stood in the clearing as the emissaries gathered their supplies. They wore simple clothes, nothing that would draw attention. Their weapons were hidden or disguised as tools. Each carried a small leather pouch containing dried yam, a handful of medicinal herbs, flint and steel, a roll of thin rope, and a small carved token from Serra Alta, a symbol, a reminder, a promise. Benedita placed her hand on each token before handing them out. "So the land remembers you," she said. Jacinta, one of the emissaries, touched the token reverently. "What if we're stopped?" she asked softly. Aparecida met her gaze. "Tell the truth," she said. "The world is more confused by truth than by lies." Jacinta nodded, though fear still flickered behind her eyes. The mountain watches. The entire community gathered to see them off. Children clung to parents. Young warriors stood tall but tense. Elders whispered prayers older than any written language. The sun rose higher, brushing the peak of the ridge with gold. Aparecida stepped forward. "When you leave this mountain," she said, "you do not walk alone. Every step you take carries us with you." She looked at each emissary in turn. "Speak carefully. Listen deeply. Observe everything." Then she added something she had not planned to say. "And if fear finds you, remember that fear is not an enemy. Fear is a compass. Use it." Lorenzo bowed his head. "We will." The first steps down the ridge. The emissaries formed 3 groups and began descending into the forest. The path was steep but familiar to their feet. Each group carried a small clay pot of Serra Alta's fire, protected inside a woven basket, so the flame wouldn't die. It was symbolic, yes, but also practical. Fire starts stories. Fire ends stories. And the emissaries carried both possibilities. Aparecida watched until the last figure vanished into the trees. She did not cry. She did not sigh. She simply whispered, "Go." The work at home intensifies. With the emissaries gone, Serra Alta turned inward, but not to hide, to build. The watchers doubled their patrols. New shelters were dug into the hillside, disguised with layered branches and soil. Women built food storage pits lined with dried palm leaves. Men reinforced wooden barriers along the lower trails, creating choke points only Serra Alta's people could navigate. Children practiced signal calls. One whistle, hide. Two whistles, gather. Three whistles, danger's near. For whistles, run uphill. They practiced until the calls became instinct. Lua Morena supervised martial training. She taught the warriors to fight without anger. Anger makes the arm heavy, she repeated. Clarity makes it precise. Some warriors still trembled when swinging a blade. Good, she said. Trembling means you know exactly what is at stake. Meanwhile, on the northern trail, Jacinta and her partner moved through thick underbrush. The forest on the northern side of Serra Alta was denser, alive with insect hum and dripping dew. Jacinta paused suddenly. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Her partner shook his head. "No." "What?" She pointed. A faint rhythmic tapping. Not quite human. Not quite natural. Her partner frowned. "A woodpecker?" Jacinta listened more carefully. "No," she whispered. "That's a warning call. Not from Serra Alta. From another Colombo. Someone else was watching the trail." She didn't smile, but her heart did. The world wasn't empty. On the coastal route, Lorenzo and his companion traveled toward the salt-scented air. The path was quieter, more open, but also more dangerous. Easy to spot travelers, easy to ambush them. They stopped when they saw smoke rising in a narrowing valley. Lorenzo lifted a hand. "Stay low," he murmured. They crawled forward and peered through the reeds. A small camp, 3 men, not soldiers, but armed, drunk, reckless, restless. One man kicked a tin cup across the ground. "The slaves are running everywhere now," he snarled. "Yesterday, I heard some fools say a mountain is hiding them." Another laughed. "Let them hide. We'll burn the whole forest if we have to." Lorenzo felt his blood rise. A flame trying to turn into fire. He forced it down. "Not yet. Not this way." He touched his companion's arm. "We go around," he whispered, because the mission was not to fight. The mission was to reach ears that needed to hear. On the Victoria Road, the siblings, Anna and Nestor, moved quickly along the worn dirt path. They knew every turn, every thorn bush, every puddle from years when they were forced to carry goods for Rosario's overseers. Now they walked as free messengers. Anna suddenly slowed. "Nestor, look." A line of fresh hoof prints. Not just one horse. Many. She knelt, touching the dried mud. "Militia?" her brother asked. Anna nodded. "And heading where we're going." Nestor exhaled through his teeth. "We'll have to be faster." "No," Anna corrected quietly. "We'll have to be smarter." They slipped off the road and into the underbrush, following a parallel, hidden path. Freedom had taught them creativity. Fear had taught them strategy. Both were needed now. Back in Serra Alta, something shifts. Near midday, Bento felt a tremor run through soil. Not large, not violent, but intentional. He knelt and pressed his palm to the earth. A warning. He ran to Aparecida. "They're moving," he said. Aparecida tensed. "Silverio?" "Not sure, but someone is coming." She didn't hesitate. "Call the watchers. Brace the children's tunnels. Tell Lua Morena to sound a quiet drum." Bento nodded and sprinted away. Aparecida exhaled slowly. "They didn't even wait a full day," she murmured. The mountain seemed to agree. The drum that isn't heard, but felt. At the far end of Serra Alta, Lua Morena struck the quiet drum. Not loud, not rhythmic. A single, deep pulse. It didn't echo. It didn't carry through the air. It carried through the land. Warriors stopped what they were doing. Children froze mid-step. The elders lifted their heads. Aparecida felt it vibrate through her ribs. "The mountain is warning us," Benedita said softly. Aparecida nodded. So be it. She stepped forward. Everyone to your positions. Do not panic. Do not run. We know this place. They do not. The community moved with silent coordination, just as the first rustle of unfamiliar steps reached the forest. There are certain sounds a forest should never make. Not the crack of a falling branch, not the distant call of a night bird, not even the thrum of an approaching storm. Those sounds belong to nature, but the sound that reached Serra Alta now, that sound did not. It was human, heavy, metallic, intentional. Bootsteps where boots should not be. The first watchers signaled from the treetops using flashes of polished stone. 3 glints in the sunlight. They're close. They're many. They're armed. Aparecida felt the air shift around her. The forest had gone too still. That meant danger was no longer approaching. Danger was here. The watchers report. Bento sprinted to the clearing, dust rising around his ankles. Aparecida, he said between breaths. There are at least 15 men. 15? She repeated. That's not a scouting group. That's a message. He nodded grimly. They're moving slower this time, more cautious. They know the mountain can push back. Aparecida, clench your jaw. Then we don't wait for them to learn new courage. Lua Morena approached, spear in hand, eyes sharp. We take defensive positions, she said. We show them that the same mountain they fear has a memory. The children are hidden, but differently this time. In previous invasions, they had hidden the children deep inside the natural tunnels under the terraces. But this time, something had changed. This time, the children did not look afraid. They moved calmly, one by one, guided by older youths whispering instructions. Stay quiet. Stay low. Remember your signals. Stick together. Some children carried small pouches of dried leaves, herbs Benedita had prepared to help them stay calm. Others carried tiny stones marked with paint, signals they could leave behind if separated. A little girl tugged Aparecida's dress. Aren't you coming with us? Aparecida knelt. This time, she whispered, I need to stay out here. The girl nodded with surprised maturity. Because you're not hiding anymore. Aparecida kissed her forehead. That's right. The first glimpse of the intruders. On the lower trail, the intruders paused. These were not the same reckless, loud Capangas as before. They moved with discipline, but not military discipline. The discipline of men who had been humiliated once and were determined not to be humiliated again. Silverio was not with them, but his shadow was. 2 men wore pieces of Rosario's old overseer uniforms. Another carried a lantern engraved with the Amaral family crest, a symbol of landowners who wanted revenge. And at the front walked a tall, wide-shouldered man with a cold expression. He carried a rifle in one hand, machete on his hip. He was not Silverio. He was worse. He was someone hired specifically because Silverio had failed. His name, whispered down the trail by trembling farmers, was Mateus Braga, a hunter by trade, a tracker by instinct, a man whose reputation was a long shadow stretching across Espírito Santo. When he stepped onto the trail, the forest tightened. Even the wind felt hesitant. Mateus Braga's first words. Braga stopped, surveyed the trail, then spoke to his men. Eyes up, ears open. This place swallows fools. One of his men muttered, Do you believe the stories? About the mountain? About them? Braga didn't laugh. He didn't scoff. He simply said, I believe in 2 things. Tracks don't lie, and people who vanish don't vanish for nothing. He knelt, brushing his fingers across a patch of disturbed soil. They were here, he said, not long ago. The men exchanged uneasy looks. The watchers make their move. From above, hidden among branches, Bento watched. When Braga reached the second narrow in the trail, Bento signaled silently. A small rock rolled onto the dirt below. Not loud, not dangerous. Just enough to say, We are here. We are watching. Step carefully. Braga didn't look up. He simply tilted his head. Someone wants to play, he said quietly. He stood. Keep walking, but not quickly. His men obeyed, though not comfortably. Aparecida's war council. Back at Serra Alta, Aparecida gathered her core team. Lua Morena, Bento, Benedita, 2 elders, and 4 warriors from Rosario. She traced the trail shapes in the dirt with a stick. "They're not charging," she said. "They're studying." Lua Morena agreed. "They're hunting knowledge, not bodies. Not yet." Benedita murmured. "That makes them more dangerous than the last ones." Bento pointed to the ridge. "We could use the canyon choke point. That's where the land helps us." Aparecida shook her head. "No, not yet. If we show our strongest cards now, they'll return with twice the force." One of the Rosario survivors asked, "So what do we do?" Aparecida's answer was simple. "We show them nothing." She lifted her eyes. "We let the mountain speak first." Mateus Braga test the forest. On the trail, Braga paused again. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scents around him. "Smoke," he muttered, "but not close." He touched a leaf, damp, but disturbed recently. He ran his hand through the dirt. Someone passed barefoot. "Light." Then he stopped. A single thin thread of woven grass was tied to a branch above. Not a trap, a signal. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, "They're sending messages to each other." One of his men asked, "You can read that?" Braga answered, "I can read intention." He stepped forward and cut the grass thread with a small knife. The forest responds. When the thread fell, a shiver ran through the nearby foliage. Braga's men looked around nervously. "Did you feel that?" One whispered. Braga didn't answer, but his shoulders stiffened slightly. He turned to his men. "They know we're here," he said, "and they're choosing whether to show themselves." He looked up at the ridge. "And I want them to show themselves." Aparecida makes a choice. On the ridge, Bento rushed Aparecida. He cut the signal thread. Her jaw tightened. Then he wants a response. "What do we do?" Aparecida closed her eyes for a moment. She listened, not for footsteps, not for voices, for the mountain. And the mountain gave no warning, only readiness. "We respond," she said, "but not with fear." The first contact. Aparecida walked to the ridge's edge, visible enough to be seen but not close enough to risk a shot. The forest parted slightly around her, not dramatically, but respectfully. Braga noticed immediately. He raised a hand, stopping his men. He stared up at her. No hatred, no surprise. Recognition. A woman who stood like the land itself. Aparecida's voice carried clearly. "This mountain doesn't want to fight. Walk back." Braga's answer was steady. "I'm not here to kill." "You're armed," she replied. "So are you." A pause. A long one. Then Braga said the sentence that turned the forest cold. "I'm here to take back what doesn't belong to you." Aparecida's expression hardened. "And what is that?" Braga lifted his chin. "People." For a moment, nothing moved. Not the leaves, not the wind, not the breath of the watchers hidden in the treetops. The forest seemed to understand that the next words exchanged between Aparecida and Mateus Braga would decide far more than a single encounter. These were not two people speaking. These were two worlds colliding. The first clash of words. Aparecida stood tall at the ridge, her silhouette outlined by broken sunlight. Braga remained on the trail below, feet planted firmly, his men waiting for his command. She repeated her question. "What people are you talking about?" Braga raised his chin slightly. "The ones from Rosario. The ones who burned the ingenio. The ones who belong to the landowners." Aparecida's expression didn't change. "They do not belong to anyone." Braga shrugged once coldly. "Not my argument. I'm paid to retrieve them." Benedita, hidden behind a cluster of trees, whispered to Bento. "He speaks like a man who feels nothing." Bento whispered back. "No, he speaks like a man who refuses to feel anything." Aparecida's counter. Aparecida leaned forward slightly, not enough to seem aggressive, but enough to be undeniably clear. "You came up a mountain you don't understand, into a land that doesn't want you here. To collect people who don't want you. Braga didn't blink. I don't need their permission. And you think you'll find cooperation? She asked. Braga exhaled softly, as though stating a fact rather than a threat. I don't need cooperation either. The watchers along the ridge tightened their grips on branches and rope. Children in the tunnels felt the tension through the ground. The forest inhaled. Braga's philosophy of chains. Braga took a few steps closer, slow, measured, deliberate. You want to be free, he said. Fine. Everyone wants something. But freedom, he continued, does not erase property. It does not erase debt. It does not erase the anger of men who think something was stolen from them. Aparecida raised an eyebrow. And you agree with them? Braga shrugged again. I agree with payment. I agree with order. And I agree with consequences. Aparecida felt something inside her tighten. This man was not like Silverio. Silverio was rage. Braga was structure. And structure is far harder to break. Aparecida's truth. She stepped closer to the ridge edge, the forest shifting with her. You think you're here to restore order, she said. But you're here because men like you are terrified. Braga narrowed his eyes. Of what? Aparecida answered without hesitation. Of a world where people like us are not kneeling. Braga's jaw tightened, only slightly, but enough to show she had struck exactly where she intended. He said nothing, and silence, when held correctly, is a confession. The mountain adds its voice. A sudden tremor rolled through the ridge. Not strong, not dangerous. Just enough to make dust rise. Just enough to make Braga's men look around anxiously. One soldier whispered, "This place isn't right." Another, "It feels alive." Braga silenced them with a sharp look. But even he shifted his stance, adjusting his balance as though the ground had unsettled him. Aparecida spoke softly, but her voice carried through the trees. You can feel it, can't you? This mountain is not on your side. Braga didn't deny it. He simply said, I'm not on its side either. The offer that is an offer. Braga lifted his rifle. Not high, not aimed, just enough to emphasize his words. You can hand them over, he said, peacefully. Aparecida's lips didn't even twitch. There's no peace in surrender. Braga nodded once. Then hand them over violently. And then you choose the shape of the ending, not the ending itself. Bento muttered under his breath. He talks like he's already dug our graves. Benedita whispered, yes, but he hasn't asked if we plan on lying in them. Aparecida begins to turn the blade. Aparecida's voice shifted. No longer defensive, no longer confrontational. Now it was surgical. You think this is a retrieval mission, she said. Braga frowned. It is... No, Aparecida corrected. It's a warning. From the men who hired you, from the world that raised you, from the fear that brought you up this mountain. Braga lifted his rifle slightly higher. Careful, but she continued. You weren't hired to bring anyone back. You were hired to make us afraid again. Braga's eyes flinched barely, but Aparecida saw it. She stepped closer to the ridge. And that, she said, is the mission you cannot complete. Braga's mask cracks. For the first time, something shifted behind Braga's eyes. Not doubt, not hesitation, recognition. He understood now that this woman would rather die on this ridge than give him anything. He understood that these people were not fugitives. They were survivors, and survivors rarely surrender. Braga lowered the rifle half an inch. Aparecida, he said, you are making choices that will get people killed. Aparecida answered, and you are making choices that will get you buried. The words dropped like stones into a shallow river. Braga's men stiffened. Some took a step backward. Others tightened their grips. One man whispered a prayer. Braga did not move, but his silence changed tone. It was no longer the silence of confidence. It was a silence before an explosion, the moment the forest chooses a side. Suddenly, a gust of wind rushed through the clearing. Cold, fast, swirling leaves in spiral around Aparecida. The trees groaned. Birds lifted at once from the canopy. Bento inhaled sharply. The mountain is choosing. Benedita closed her eyes. Then so must we. Aparecida lifted her chin. Turn back, she said to Braga. This is your last chance. Braga's jaw tightened. He raised his rifle, fully this time, and quietly he answered, no. Aparecida's final warning. Aparecida did not flinch, not even a muscle. She simply said, then remember this moment, Mateus Braga. Remember the ridge you stand on. Remember the air you're breathing. Remember the silence before your first shot. She took one step closer. And remember that you chose to aim at people who have already died once. The wind stopped. The forest held its breath. Braga moved his finger toward the trigger, and Aparecida whispered, do it. And the world shrank to one thing, a finger on a trigger. Mateus Braga's grip tightened. The metal felt familiar in his hand. Too familiar. Below him, his men tensed, breaths caught halfway. Above him, Serra Alta watched the ridge in absolute stillness. Aparecida did not move. She could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear the faint rustle of leaves. She could hear distant children breathing in tunnels under the earth. But above all, she heard one thing, her own refusal. The first shot, Braga pulled the trigger. The sound of the rifle cracked through the forest like lightning desperate to become thunder. Birds exploded from the trees. Dust leapt from the ridge. Echoes rolled through stone and root. And then, pain, not hers. To her left, one of Serra Alta's warriors, a former Rosario worker named Joao, staggered backward, a cry tearing from his throat. The bullet had grazed his shoulder, hot and vicious, carving a line of blood across his flesh. He didn't fall. He clutched the wound, teeth clenched, eyes blazing. I'm still here, he growled. It wasn't bravado. It was proof. The mountain answers. As Joao's blood hit the soil, the ground shuddered. This time, it was no subtle tremor, no warning, no half measure. The ridge shook, sending small stones rolling down the slope. Roots shifted. Tree trunks creaked as if twisting their spines. Braga's men stumbled. One of them fell to his knees. What was that? He yelled. Another shouted. It's the mountain. It's the mountain. Braga bit down the urge to shout them into silence, because he felt it too. This wasn't an ordinary aftershock. This was reaction, response. A judgment passed through earth, a change in Aparecida's eyes. Aparecida glanced at Joao's wound, quickly assessing. Not fatal, not deep enough to pull him from the fight, unless infection won later. She exhaled once, not in relief, in decision. All right, she said softly, more the mountain than to herself. Then we stopped asking. She raised her voice. Mateus Braga. Her tone cut through the chaos like a blade through cloth. Braga snapped his attention back to her. You have made your choice, she said. He answered coldly. So have you. The signal. Aparecida didn't shout. She didn't wave her arms. She didn't chant. She simply lifted her right hand, 2 fingers, and then she lowered them. That was all it took. From the sides of the trail ahead of Braga's men, ropes snapped free. Hidden logs rolled down from higher ground, bumping and crashing into the path. Not aimed to crush, but to divide, to separate. The militia scattered, some jumping back, some pressed against the rock face. Form up, Braga shouted. They tried. The mountain disagreed. The terrain turns against them. The logs didn't roll straight. They curved, bounced, turned, guided by uneven ground that Serra Alta had studied for years. Each impact sent vibrations up through the men's legs. Dust blew up into their faces. Visibility dropped. Braga coughed, eyes squinting. Hold your positions. But positions meant nothing on a path that refused to stay still. One man misstepped, his foot sliding on loose dirt. He tumbled, shoulder first, into a low trench cleverly disguised with leaves. A snare tightened around his ankle, flipping him to the ground with a brutal jerk. He screamed as he hit the earth. Traps, someone yelled. They trapped the whole path. Serra Alta's way of fighting. Up on the ridge, Lua Morena moved like a shadow on stone. We do not rush down, she told the warriors. We do not charge. We let the mountain tire them. She signaled with a short, sharp whistle. From further along the ridge, two warriors loosed small stones tied thin ropes, swinging them in arcs before releasing. The stones didn't aim for heads. They aimed for rifles. One rock struck the barrel of a gun, jarring it from its owner's hands. Another knocked a machete from its sheath. Chaos shifted flavor, from tense anticipation to disordered panic. Braga gritted his teeth. Enough. Aim for the ridge. Several rifles swung upward. Aparecida stepped back just in time as bullets cracked against rock, sending shards flying. One shard grazed her cheek, drawing a thin red line. She didn't flinch. Blood fell. The ground shook again. The mountain tightens its grip. This time, the tremor sent a portion of the slope crumbling, not in a deadly landslide, but in a controlled collapse. Rocks tumbled between the militia and the ridge, forming a rough barrier, not high, not impenetrable, just enough to remind Braga of one thing. He was not the one shaping this battlefield. He fired again, this time at random, the bullet thunking uselessly into a tree trunk. The tree swayed, leaves shivering, then slowly leaned away from the ridge, as if refusing to give him a better shot. Benedita watched from the shadows, eyes shining. "Do you see it?" She whispered to no one in particular. "It remembers Rosario." Braga doubles down. "Stop shooting blindly." Braga barked. He lowered his rifle and took a deliberate step forward. "If we push through this choke point," he said to his man, "we reach them. If we retreat now, every landowner who paid for this will understand one thing." One of his men asked, "What?" "That the world," Braga said, "belongs more to them than it does to us." He looked up at Aparecida. "And I don't plan on living in that world." Aparecida's eyes narrowed. "You already do." A new kind of fire. Back inside Serra Alta, in the longhouse, Benedita and the elders moved quickly. The herbs were already laid out, the resin already melting over slow coals, the flames already burning low and steady. "Are we ready?" one elder asked. Benedita nodded. "It's time." They began to chant, not loudly, not theatrically, but with the hush of people speaking to something that is always listening. Words from before slavery, words from before Brazil, words from before the maps. The smoke that rose from the coals did not spread evenly. It curled in a single direction, downhill, toward the ridge, toward the conflict, toward the choice. Smoke with a memory. On the trail, one of Braga's men sniffed the air. "Do you smell that?" Another grimaced. Not gunpowder, not normal smoke. Braga inhaled. The scent was strangely familiar, like burning wood and something else. Something like old rain on stone. Something like earth after a grave is closed. The smoke drifted low, hugging the ground, swirling around their boots. It wasn't thick enough to choke, just thick enough to remind them. They were standing on a land that had already buried more than they could imagine. Aparecida raises a different kind of weapon. On the ridge, Aparecida wiped the blood from her cheek and let it fall onto the soil. "Aren't you going to shoot again?" Braga called. She shook her head. "No," he sneered. "Out of courage, out of respect," she answered. "For the dead." His sneer faltered. "What dead?" She gestured the forest. "All the ones you never counted, the ones you never wrote down, the ones your employers turned into numbers and shadows." Braga opened his mouth to respond, but the smoke reached him then. His words caught in his throat. He coughed once, twice, not violently, just enough to feel human, just enough to feel mortal. The men began to break. One of the militia dropped his rifle completely. "I can't do this," he muttered. "This place is cursed." Another grabbed his arm. "We're being paid." "I don't care." He backed away, eyes wide. This isn't justice. This isn't order. This is revenge with uniform. No one corrected him, because he was right, and Braga's silence admitted it. Another man dropped to one knee, pressing his hands to the earth as if hoping it would steady him. "It's shaking," he said. "It's barely moving," his companion replied. "That's enough," the kneeling man whispered. Land should move under your anger. Braga's last attempt to control. I said hold. Braga roared. He fired a shot into the air. Everyone flinched. The echo slammed into the ridge, bounced between trees, and dissolved. Aparecida watched him. "You're not here for order," she said quietly. "You're here," she continued, "so that when your employers sleep, they don't have to imagine us still standing." Braga's jaw flexed. He aimed again, this time not at her, but at Joao, the wounded warrior. He fired. The bullet struck rock inches from Joao's head, sending stone chips flying into his hair. Joao laughed, a short, rough sound. "You missed twice," he shouted. Braga's eyes darkened. This wasn't tactics anymore. This was ego. And ego bleeds more easily than flesh. There comes a point in every conflict when the mask drops, when intentions can no longer hide behind orders, or behind uniforms, or behind phrases like, "just doing my job." Block 20 is that moment. For Mateus Braga, for Serra Alta, for the mountain, for the story itself. The air felt tight enough to snap. The smoke and the elders' ritual curled around trees in slow spirals, weaving a language only the land could understand. Braga lifted his rifle again, and this time, something in Aparecida's expression changed. She had stopped warning, stopped persuading, stopped asking. Now, she was deciding. The misfire. Braga aimed at Joao again, but when he pulled the trigger, click. No bullet. A misfire. A sound so small, yet so devastating, that even his men froze. Braga stared at the gun as if it had betrayed him. He tapped the chamber, checked the hammer, tried again. Click. Still nothing. Aparecida tilted her head. "Your weapon is refusing." Braga growled. "It's a misfire, not a miracle." "The land doesn't know the difference," Aparecida replied. Behind her, Benedita whispered to Zé Bento, "Fire remembers blood. Metal remembers cruelty." Zé Bento nodded. "And misfires remember fear. Panic spreads like smoke." One of Braga's men backed away, stumbling. "Sir, this is wrong. Everything is wrong." Another dropped his rifle completely. "I'm not doing this. I don't care how much they pay." Braga snapped. "Stand your ground." The man shook his head violently. "This ground isn't ours." He ran. Not far, just a few yards down the trail, but it was enough to break the line. Two others followed him. A third hesitated, and then lowered his weapon. Braga watched them with cold fury. Cowards, traitors, weak links, and yet their fear was not irrational. It was honest. The forest tightens its circle. From above, Serra Alta's warriors move into new positions, not to attack, to guide. Branches swayed in synchronized rhythm, not wind-blown, not random, like hands pointing, like the forest itself shaping the battlefield. Aparecida raised her palm to signal. Zé Bento and three warriors slid down a side path, unseen by the militia. Lua Morena prepared rope snares tested in countless drills. Joao, wounded but unbroken, took a position behind a jutting boulder, ready to defend or die, whichever the moment required. Braga noticed their shifting shadows. He understood now. He was surrounded, not by numbers, not by weapons, by purpose. And purpose terrifies men who rely on fear. The final warning. Aparecida spoke again, but her voice was different. Not soft, not harsh. Final. Mateus Braga, this is your last chance to leave alive. Not as a threat, as a truth. Braga raised his chin. "You think you can frighten me?" "No," she said. "I think fear already chose its side." Braga's jaw clenched. His eyes flicked up the ridge, scanning every movement. His men whispered behind him, "We should go. She's right. This place is what we're dying in." Braga snapped. "Quiet." But the forest swallowed command. A bird called, an unusual sound, 3 descending notes. Zé Bento recognized it instantly. "Signal from the northern watchers," he murmured. "More are coming." Aparecida didn't react, outwardly, but inside, the flame of certainty grew. This was it. Braga makes his decision. Braga looked at Aparecida one last time, and in his eyes she saw it. Not hatred, not duty, wounded pride. The kind of pride that chooses destruction over retreat. He lifted his machete. Not the rifle, the machete. A blade meant for close-range violence. A blade meant to send a message. Joao spit at the ground. You choose iron over truth. Braga snarled. I choose what ends this. Aparecida answers without moving. She did not draw a weapon. She did not attack. She simply said, then the mountain will answer you now. Braga lunged. The mountain moves. Their movements so subtle they seem impossible. A slight shift in the soil beneath Braga's boot. A root rising an inch at the exact moment his weight shifted. A patch of dirt loosening like a sigh. Braga's foot slid. Just enough to break his lunge. Just enough to force him off balance. Just enough to save Aparecida's life. He stumbled forward, slashing at air. Aparecida stepped aside with fluid precision. Braga swore, regaining balance, and then a rope tightened around his legs. Lua Morena had thrown it from above, catching his ankles with perfect timing. Braga fell hard. The breath punched out of him. His machete clattered against a stone. His men gasped. Sir, the standstill. Aparecida walked down a few steps of the ridge, slow, steady, controlled. She stopped several paces above him. You still have a choice, she said. Braga spat blood into the dirt. I don't need choices. Aparecida crouched slightly, looking him in the eyes. That is why you lose. He roared and reached for his machete. A stone from above struck his hand. Thrown by Joao, not hard enough to break bone, just hard enough to stop him. Braga's fingers went limp. The machete slipped from his grasp. Aparecida stood again. Mateus Braga, she said, this mountain will decide your fate now. The forest speaks again. A low moan passed through the trees. Branches swayed in unison. Leaves fell like ash. The tremor returned, stronger this time. One of Braga's men screamed. The ground, it's sinking. Another shouted. No, no, it's lifting. Neither was completely right. The ground did neither. It shifted. Braga rolled to his knees, trying to stand, and the soil beneath him rose an inch, enough to throw off his balance again. He fell a second time. He looked up at Aparecida, breath ragged. What are you? She answered calmly. Alive. The breaking point. Braga's men cracked. 2 turned and ran down the trail. 3 dropped their weapons. 1 simply stood frozen, tears running silently down his face. Only 2 remained beside Braga, and even they trembled. Braga forced himself to his feet. I will not. A root coiled slightly beneath him. He faltered. Aparecida lifted one hand. Enough. He froze, not because of fear of her, but fear of what stood behind her. Silence. The kind of silence only a land ready to act can make. The moment before judgment. Aparecida took a slow breath. This is the last decision you get to make, she said. Walk away, she continued, and you leave with your life. Stay. Her voice sharpened. And the mountain will teach you the price of insisting on owning what you never owned. Braga breathed hard, chest heaving, eyes darting between her and the forest around him. His pride fought his survival. His anger fought his instinct. His orders fought the truth, standing right in front of him. And then he chose. He lifted his foot toward her, toward battle, toward the fire at the heart of Serra Alta. Aparecida whispered, so be it. The mountain trembled. There are moments when time stops pretending to move in straight lines. This was one of them. Mateus Braga lifted his foot toward the ridge, toward Aparecida, toward Serra Alta, toward everything his world insisted had no right to exist. The forest held its breath. The mountain remembered, and the past leaned forward. The step that went nowhere. Braga put his weight down, but the ground didn't accept it. His boots sank deeper than it should have, not into mud, not into a hole, but into something that felt like resistance. He tried to pull back. The earth held him, not tight enough to swallow him, but tight enough to say, you are not welcome here. He snarled, forcing his leg free with a violent yank. He staggered, catching himself on a nearby tree. The bark scratched his palm, leaving splinters. He stared at his hand as if the tree had insulted him. Aparecida watched calmly. "The land has given its answer," she said. Braga glared up at her. "I'll make it change its mind." The mountain loses patience. The tremor returned, deep rolling, insistent. It moved through stone and root and bone. This time, even Aparecida had to widen her stance to keep balance. Children in the tunnels pressed closer together. Elders in the longhouse placed their hands flat on the floor, eyes closed, listening. Benedita whispered, "It's not angry, it's tired." "Tired of what?" one of the younger elders asked. "Tired of carrying so much blood," she replied. Outside, the forest groaned. Braga's men stumbled, grabbing at branches. One fell to the ground, palms scraping on gravel. "This isn't natural," he gasped. A voice from a nearby tree answered softly, "Nothing about what you're doing is natural." They didn't see who said it, but Aparecida did. Bento perched among the branches, eyes steady. The final line. Aparecida's voice cut through the trembling air. No more warnings. Her words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Everyone heard. On the ridge, behind her, Serra Alta's warriors stepped fully into view. No longer just shadows. Men, women, elders, youths, some armed, some not, all present, all visible. Braga saw their faces clearly now, not the blur of enemies. People who had chosen to stand. His breathing quickened. "This is your last chance to surrender," he yelled anyway, grasping at the only script he knew. Aparecida answered. "We stopped surrendering the night Rosario burned." The ground finally speaks. The tremor peaked. It wasn't an earthquake. It was alignment. Rocks shifted just enough to block certain paths. Roots rose just enough to trip running feet. A narrow crack opened in the trail ahead of Braga. Not wide, not deep, but decisive. A line drawn by the land itself, separating him from the ridge, separating aggression from existence, separating those who wanted to erase from those who refused to disappear. Braga stared at the crack, then at Aparecida. His voice came out strained. "You think a line in the dirt stops me?" She answered gently. "It stopped the last ones." A choice no longer theoretical. Braga looked back at his men. Some were already retreating. Some stood frozen, torn between orders and instinct. Some watched him the way people watch a gambler who has bet everything on a single card. He turned again toward the ridge, jaw clenched. He could still try. He could jump the crack. He could run forward. He could attempt to carve his victory into this mountain with iron and rage. But something stopped him. Not the line, not the tremor, not Aparecida's unflinching gaze. It was a realization that if he crossed that line, he wouldn't be fighting a group of runaways. He'd be fighting a people. And people like that don't just lose. They become stories. Stories that travel. Stories that return. Stories that haunt. The ghosts catch up. Aparecida spoke again, softer now. "How many have you hunted?" Braga didn't reply. "How many families?" she continued. "How many nights have you broken with your boots? How many children woke up to the sound of you dragging someone away?" His breath hitched. He had expected threats, not memory. "You think this is about power," she said. "It's about debt." One of Braga's men whispered. "Sir, she's right." Braga's head snapped toward him. "What did you say?" The man swallowed. "I mean, we can't keep doing this. The law changed. The world changed. We're the only one pretending it didn't." Braga stared at him as if he'd grown a second face. Then he looked at the ridge again. At Joao, wounded but standing. At Lua Morena, unarmed but unafraid to step forward if needed. At the elders, whose very presence said, "We have outlived worse men than you." At Aparecida, whose gaze held no hatred, only truth, a moment of brutal honesty. For a heartbeat, Braga saw himself from the outside, a hired man, paid with money that reeked of sugar and suffering, sent by people who would never climb this mountain themselves, a weapon with a name, He felt the weight of every step he'd taken for them. Every person dragged back in chains. Every scream muffled in a sackcloth night. Every time he told himself he had no choice. A voice inside him, small, long-buried, whispered, "You chose every time." He clenched his teeth. "Enough," he muttered, but he wasn't speaking to Aparecida anymore. He was arguing with himself. The only way out. Aparecida took a deep breath. Then she did something no one expected. She stepped down one more level on the ridge, reducing the height between them. Not to approach, to meet. "I am not asking you to believe our pain," she said. He glared. "I am asking you to believe one thing only, that if you step further, you will not leave this mountain." Braga's hand tightened around the rifle. His knuckles whitened. He could feel every eye on him. His men, her people, the mountain. Even the air seemed to be watching. He lifted his foot and, for the first time since he arrived, he stepped back. Just once. Just a few inches. But it changed everything. The men decide before he does. The moment his heel touched the earth behind him, two of his men threw down their rifles. "I'm done," one said. "I'm not dying for this." Another nodded. "They're not running. They're not attacking. They're just standing there. We're the ones who came up here with guns." A third man turned away. "I've got kids. I'm going home." They began to walk down the trail, slowly at first, then faster, as if afraid the land would change its mind and call them back. Braga shouted, "Cowards!" One of them looked over his shoulder. "Maybe," he called back, "but at least we're still men." Braga's pride stands alone. In the span of a few breaths, Braga's group was cut in half. The ones who remained did not stay out of loyalty. They stayed because fear had frozen them. The fear of turning their backs. The fear of facing the landowners without a story of victory. The fear of realizing they had spent their lives on the wrong side of history. Braga stood alone at the front, chest heaving, eyes burning. Aparecida watched him with something close to sadness. "You can leave with them," she said quietly. "You can walk down this mountain. You can keep your life." He hissed. "And live with what?" "Yourself," she replied. "The true enemy." For the first time, Braga understood. He could fight Serra Alta. He could fight the mountain. He could fight these people. But he could not fight the thing that would follow him everywhere. The knowledge of what he had been, and what he could have chosen instead. He looked up at the ridge one last time. "You think you've won," he said. Aparecida shook her head. "No, there is no winning here. There's only surviving with or without shame." The words landed inside him like stones in water. He turned, slowly, painfully, step by step. Mateus Braga began to walk back down the mountain, not defeated, exposed. The men who remained followed him, heads low. None of them looked back. The mountain did not stop them. It had made its point, what the land keeps. When they disappeared into the trees, the tremor faded. The smoke thinned. The branches relaxed. And Serra Alta exhaled as one body. Some warriors dropped to their knees. Others wept quietly. Children emerged from the tunnels, blinking in the changing light. João sat down heavily, finally feeling the pain in his shoulder. Lua Morena put a hand on his back. "You stood," she said. He chuckled weakly. "I wasn't about to fall in front of that man." Benedita looked at Aparecida. "You know what this means," she said. Aparecida nodded. "Yes, they didn't just see a hidden people today." She looked out at the trail, where Braga had vanished. They saw a people the land itself refused to crush. When Mateus Braga disappeared into the tree line, the forest did not return to normal. Something had changed. The air felt heavier, as if trying to absorb everything that had just happened. The leaves trembled with memory. Even the sunlight seemed differente, less innocent, more aware. The people of Serra Alta stood on the ridge, staring at the trail long after Braga had vanished. Because victories don't always feel like victories. Sometimes they feel like storms that leave the world too quiet afterward. The first breath after survival, Aparecida finally exhaled. It was not relief. It was release. She looked behind her, at João, at Lua Morena, At Benedita, at the elders, at the youths with trembling hands pretending not to tremble. "We stand," she said softly. No one replied. They didn't need to. The act of standing was the reply. Bento approached her quietly. "You should rest," he murmured. She shook her head. "No, not yet. Because rest is for moments when the world stops looking at you." And Serra Alta had never been more watched. Joao's wound in the price of keeping ground. Joao tried to rise but staggered. Pain shot up to his shoulder. Lua Morena caught him by the arm. "I'm fine," he insisted. "You bled on the land," Lua murmured. "That's never fine." They helped him to the longhouse where Benedita had already lit a small fire and spread the herbs that smelled of earth and bitterness. As Benedita cleaned the wound, Joao winced. "Don't make that face," Benedita said. "The land saw your courage." He smirked through the pain. "Does the land also help with healing?" Benedita's eyes sparkled, only when asked politely. The retreating footsteps. Far down the trail, Braga and his remaining men walked in tense silence. The forest did not attack them, but it did not welcome them. Branches seemed to lower as they passed. Shadows clung to them like judgment. Birds stayed silent. One of the men whispered. She didn't lie. "We wouldn't have left alive." Braga said nothing, because he didn't believe that anymore. He knew it. Every step he took was a step away from what he could have become and toward what he would now have to live with. When they finally reached the base of the mountain, one man turned to him. "What are we going to tell the landowners?" Braga stared up at the ridge. "That the world changed," he said, "and they didn't notice." Serra Alta's celebration, that isn't a celebration. Back on the ridge, Serra Alta gathered in the main clearing, not to cheer, not to dance, to breathe, pure, unbroken breath. Children peeked out from tunnels, eyes wide and glittering. "We're safe?" one asked. Aparecida crouched to look him in the eyes. "For now," she said honestly, and for longer than before. The boy nodded with the seriousness of someone much older. Then he hugged her without warning. Aparecida froze for a second, then held him tightly. Lua Morena watched with a faint smile. "You're becoming the person they look for in the dark," she said. Aparecida sighed. "I never asked for that." "No one does," Lua replied, "but the dark asks." A council without fear. The elders gathered for a meeting, not in urgency, but in clarity. The longhouse felt different now. The fire burned brighter. The shadows seemed less oppressive. The air held a new kind of stillness, the kind that comes after someone finally tells a truth that everyone else was too afraid to say. Mestre Lazaro, though weakened before, sat at the center. "Speak," he said. "What do we take from today?" Vicente, still haunted by personal ghosts, answered that the world will not stop coming to take what it believes is its own. Benedita added, and that we must stop living waiting for the next trespass. Lua Morena, and that fear cannot guide us any longer. Not fear of them, not fear of ourselves. Mestre Lazaro nodded slowly. "And you, Aparecida?" All eyes turned to her. She inhaled. "Today showed us something," she said. "We no longer fight to live." She looked at each face in the circle. "We fight to exist." Silence followed, not heavy, acknowledging. News from the trails. As the council was ending, two watchers sprinted into the clearing, breathing hard. Aparecida straightened immediately. "What is it?" The first watcher swallowed. "We saw smoke," he said, "from 3 places." A hush fell over the clearing. "Where?" Lua Morena asked. The watcher pointed. "One from the north, where Jacinta went." A murmur of worry. "Another from the coastal path, where Lorenzo should be." Murmurs grew louder, and the last from the direction of Vittoria. A cold ripple moved through the clearing. Aparecida stepped closer. "Were the smoke signals?" The watcher nodded. "Yes, all 3 were signal fires." A breath Aparecida didn't know she was holding finally escaped. "They made it," she whispered. "Signals with meaning," the watchers explained. "The northern fire burned slow and steady. That means we met allies." Relief spread like warmth through the crowd. The coastal fire burned with tall flames. That means we have warnings. Murmurs shifted, no longer relief, but readiness. And the Victoria fire burned bright with dark smoke. That means we know something you must hear. The clearing bristled. Aparecida nodded. Then when they return, everything changes. Lua Morena added, the world beyond the mountain is waking too. The weight of what comes next. Aparecida walked outside, staring at the ridge Braga had descended. Bento joined her. We survived, he said. She nodded. But survival isn't the end, she replied. What is, he asked. Aparecida breathed deeply. When the world stops deciding who we are. Bento watched her face, studying it with quiet respect. You know what you're becoming, don't you? He asked softly. Aparecida frowned. What? He smiled without humor. A mirror. She turned to him. A mirror of what? Of everything they were afraid we would become. She didn't answer, because he was right. A night with too many thoughts. That night, the skies darkened more than usual. The stars seemed hidden, as if saving their light for something else. Aparecida sat alone on the highest terrace, knees drawn up, looking out over the dark silhouette of the valley. The sounds of Serra Alta at night drifted upward. Whispers, children settling to sleep, the low crackle of evening fires. She wasn't thinking about Braga. She wasn't even thinking about the emissaries. She was thinking about legacy, about the people who had died unnamed on this mountain, about the ones who had escaped only to meet chains elsewhere, about the ones who had never run at all. She whispered to the darkness, if the mountain lifts us once, we owe it the promise to walk. A vision in the quiet. The wind shifted, cold and slow. Aparecida closed her eyes. And in that moment, she felt something she couldn't explain. Not fear, not pain, not memory. Presence, not of a person, not of a ghost, of the land. A low hum in her bones, a warmth behind her ribs, a whisper in the air. Your story is not ending. She opened her eyes. The valley seemed wider. The sky seemed closer. The darkness seemed brighter somehow. And the whisper continued. They will come again, but so will the others. A shiver ran through her, not of fear, of responsibility. The return begins. At dawn, as the first pale light broke across the mountains, Bento approached her. They're coming, he said. Aparecida nodded. Yes, I felt it. He looked surprised. How? She didn't answer. Instead, she stood, dusted off her clothes, and looked toward the northern trail. Let's gather everyone, she said. The emissaries will bring news. She closed her eyes one moment longer. And when their news arrives, our next step begins. By the time the sun rose fully over Serra Alta, the mountain was no longer simply waiting. It was expecting. The watchers had already taken their posts. Mothers had finished morning tasks with ears slightly tilted toward the trails. Children pretended to play, but their eyes kept drifting to the ridges because the emissaries were due to return. And with them would come something more dangerous than soldiers. Information. The first to return from the north, Jacinta and her partner emerged from a northern path first. They were exhausted, dust on their clothes, scratches on their arms, but their posture was upright and their eyes burned with something fierce. Hope, fear, resolve. A crowd formed almost instantly. Did you find them? Someone asked. Did they listen? Another added. Jacinta nodded, chest still rising and falling. Yes, she replied. They listened. Aparecida stepped forward. Who did you meet? Jacinta swallowed, then answered. Quilombos in the hills beyond the valley. 2 large ones, one smaller. Some already knew about Rosario's fire from rumor. Now they know the truth. And what did they say? Aparecida asked. Jacinta's gaze sharpened. They said they thought they were alone. A murmur ran through the crowd. And now, Aparecida pressed. Jacinta's voice firmed. Now they're watching, waiting, ready to help if we call. They won't march here, yet, but they will not ignore us anymore. The mountain seemed to exhale. Serra Alta, was no longer a single hidden refuge. It was a name people knew. The coastal path, news from those who watched the ports. Next came Lorenzo and his companion from the coastal route. They walked with a measured pace, bearing the weight of what they carried. Aparecida met them halfway across the clearing. "What did you find?" she asked. "Ports," Lorenzo replied. "Markets. Anger." He wiped sweat from his brow. "The ships are still busy. They're not taking enslaved people anymore, not openly, but they're moving sugar, coffee, cotton, wealth built on everything that happened before the Golden Law." "And the people?" Aparecida asked. "Those who were enslaved, now free at the coast?" Lorenzo's jaw tightened. "Many have nowhere to go. Landowners fired them from the fields, but still expect their obedience in town. Some sleep in alleys, working for half pay. Some are being tricked into contracts that look too much like chains with new paint." A bitter silence shook the clearing. "And what did you tell them?" Lua Morena asked. Lorenzo's voice softened. "That there's a mountain that remembers their names," he said. "That there is a place where the law is not the final word, where they are not ex-slaves, just people." "And are they coming?" Bento asked. "Some," Lorenzo replied. "Not all. Most are still stunned. Freedom hit them like a wave while they were still tied to the boat." Benedita sighed. "Freedom that arrives without tools is just another kind of drowning." The Vittoria Road, the most dangerous news of all. Finally, near sunset, Anna and Nestor appeared from the path to Vittoria. They looked different, not just tired, marked, as if what they had seen had reached into their bones and rearranged something. Aparecida went to them first. "Speak," she said gently. Nestor nodded to Anna. "You tell it," he murmured. Anna took a deep breath. "In Vittoria," she began, "the abolition is being printed like a victory story." She looked around, making sure everyone heard. "The newspapers are saying Brazil freed its slaves peacefully. The Golden Law ended injustice without blood. The Empire did what was right." Some of Serra Alta's people scoffed. Others looked away in quiet fury. Anna continued. "There are free black communities forming, some in the outskirts, some inside the city. They're working, trying to live, trying to believe this is a new world." "And the government?" Aparecida asked. "They don't talk about us," Anna said. "Not about Colombos, not about Rosario, especially not about a sugar mill that burned on the night of abolition." João muttered. "Of course, we don't fit in their story." Anna's eyes darkened. "There's more." The warning hidden between laws. "In the official buildings," Anna said, "a few men talk in low voices about unrest. They are not worried about landowners. They are worried about us." "The Colombos?" Bento asked. "Yes," she replied. "About Colombos that are not dying. About people who didn't wait for the Golden Law. About those who walked out of their chains by firelight instead of waiting for paper." She paused. "They fear that if our story spreads, they will lose the only thing still holding this new order together." "What is that?" Vicente asked. Anna answered with painful clarity. "The lie that this was peaceful." The words lingered in the air like smoke. The choice in front of Serra Alta. Aparecida stood in the center of the clearing. Around her, survivors of Rosario, new arrivals from the coast, refugees from other plantations, born children of Serra Alta who had never seen a shackle with their own eyes. "What they fear," she said slowly, "is not that we are free." She looked at each face, one by one. "What they fear is that we know how we became free." She took a breath. "They fear the fire that burned the ingenio. Permission. They fear a sugar mill that vanished in flames the same night a law was signed. Because our fire says their gift arrived too late." A hush followed. "But we have a choice," she continued. "We can stay here, tend our fields, raise our children, and let the city write its clean version of the story." She let the possibility hang in the air, heavy but tempting. "Or we can do something much more dangerous." Lua Morena understood. "Tell it," she said. "The stories leave the mountain. We don't leave Serra Alta. Aparecida said. A few people looked surprised. We expanded. Silence. Heads tilted. Eyes narrowed in concentration. Not with walls, she clarified. Not with territory. With memory. She turned to the emissaries. You went out and met people who thought they were alone. Now you will go again, in pairs, in small groups, not as recruiters, as storytellers. Vicente frowned. Storytellers? Yes, Aparecida replied. Some Quilambos will want to stay hidden. Some people on the coast will be too afraid to come. Some free communities will try to believe the paper version of abolition because it hurts less than the truth. She looked at them all, but they all deserve to know what really happened on that night. Anna's voice dropped. The night the Ingenio de Rosario burned. Aparecida nodded. Yes. What history will never print. Mestre Lazaro, who had been silently absorbing everything, finally spoke up. History, he said, will be written by men who never climbed this mountain. He looked at the children sitting cross-legged near the front. They will not mention your names. They will not talk about the drum beats. They will not describe the fear in the eyes of men like Silverio or Braga. They will not admit that the land trembled against oppression. He smiled sadly. They won't even mention Serra Alta. Then what are we fighting for? Someone asked. Lazaro's answer was quiet but unshakable. For more than books. He pointed to his chest. For this, for the memory that lives inside bodies, inside families, inside voices that refuse to shut up. He turned to Aparecida. Tell like that, he said. Epilogue many years later. Years passed. The Brazilian Empire fell. The Republic rose. Governments changed like seasons. New maps were drawn. Old plantations decayed. The Golden Law stayed printed in official history as a proud achievement. In classrooms, children would one day be taught. Slavery ended in 1888, peacefully. Princes and politicians signed a law. The nation progressed. They would not hear about the sugar mill that vanished in flames on the night of abolition. They would not hear about Captain Foucault wandering through ashes, searching for keys to a house that no longer existed. They would not hear about Silverio's retreat or Braga's hesitation. But in some homes, especially in the hills, especially in the valleys, especially in the cracks of the countryside, stories moved differently. An old woman in a coastal village would tell her grandchildren, "They say a law freed us. But my grandmother said the first freedom she ever saw came from fire on a faraway hill." A farmer in the interior would whisper to a gathering of neighbors, "My great-grandfather left a place where the land itself shook to protect him. He said the mountain chose its people that night." A young boy in Vitoria, descendant of someone who once ran barefoot up a trail with a beating heart, would hear a story from his father. There was a mill in Espírito Santo that didn't wait to be freed. It disappeared into the night, and in its place grew something they never put in books. The fate of Serra Alta. What happened to Serra Alta? It did not become a kingdom. It did not become a flag. It became something much harder to kill. A rumor that would not die. Some said the Quilombo dissolved slowly, its people mixing with nearby towns and free black villages, taking their knowledge and courage with them. Some said Serra Alta still existed, hidden deeper than before, opening its paths only to those who truly needed shelter. Others claimed the mountain itself swallowed the last traces of the community to keep it safe from being turned into a tourist story. But one thing remained constant. Whenever someone talked about a place where the land refused to obey injustice, the name changed, the details shifted, but the essence stayed the same. A mountain, a fire, a group of people who refused to kneel. The last image of Aparecida. No one can say for sure when Aparecida died. That's how it is with people who become more story than flesh. Some say she grew old in Serra Alta, watching over new generations who never saw a whip but inherited the memory of its shadow. Others say she left the mountain in her final years, walking from village to village as a nameless woman telling a very specific story. "Did anyone ever tell you," she'd begin, "about the sugar mill that refused to survive slavery and chose instead to burn on the night they pretended to free us?" In every version, she ended the story the same way, not with laws, not with dates, but with a question. What would you burn rather than pass on to your children? The moral that didn't fit on paper. If you're listening to this now, far from that mountain, far from that night, far from those fields, you've already stepped into the echo of what happened there. Because this is not just a story about Brazil in 1888. It's a story about every place that tries to erase what it did to the people it called less than human. It's about every law passed too late, every apology given without repair, every history book that writes peaceful where there was fire. The Ingenio do Rosario is gone. It's gold, it's ledgers, it's chains, but the choice made there to burn rather than bend still walks among us. In every community that refuses to disappear, in every voice that refuses to soften the truth, in every life that refuses to be grateful for a freedom that should never have been negotiable, the sugar mill that vanished in flames on the night of abolition never really died. It just changed shape from walls and gears and whips into something the empire never learned how to control, a memory that burns quietly inside everyone who refuses to bow to a freedom that arrived late and called itself a gift.